Hello. So I'm not just a person who makes videos on the internet. I'm also a person who watches videos on the internet. So that means I can really empathize with your situation right now. I know what it's like to click on a video, as you, I assume, have just done if you're seeing this right now, and you're like, oh my God, it's like 3 hours long. Do I want to watch this? That's why, in my infinite kindness and benevolence, I've decided to help you make this decision. This is a good video to watch if any of the following are true. 1. You want to learn things that will help you and others survive a possibly apocalyptic future. 2. You want to learn things that will help us to transform the future and transform society into one that is egalitarian, liberating ourselves from hierarchies of domination. 3. You want to learn things that will help us to stop destroying the environment, or, at least be less likely to destroy it. 4. You want to learn about Elinor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, The Evolution of Institutions for Collective Action. 5. You're curious about the collective action problem, and you want to hear some real-life, real-world examples of people solving that problem. 6. You want to hear some real-life, real-world examples of people managing scarce economic resources in ways that are egalitarian, both egalitarian in how those resources are shared and egalitarian in how management decisions are made. 7. You like videos that start with lists that are exactly 7 items long. I know there's got to be at least 1 or 2 of you out there who are into that. If 1 or more of these things is true for you, then you'll probably want to keep watching. Probably. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you just don't like me. Maybe every single item on that list is true for you, but you just don't like me. And then you just don't want to watch because you don't like me. And that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. It's fine. I'll be okay. I'll talk to my therapist and, they'll let me know that it's okay that you don't like me, that life is still worth living, even though you don't like me. And, I can get over that and find value in my life and who I am despite your rejection. I'll be okay. God damn it, I'll be okay. Anyways, there's just one more thing. Apologies to those of you who like 7-item lists, because I guess that is now ruined. Because reason number 8 is...
If you don't
watch this video,
I will look for you. I will find you. And I will kill you.
No, wait, that's not reason number 8. Please just ignore that. Sorry, I don't know how that got in there. The real reason number 8 is keep watching if you're wanting to hear about billionaires musing over whether to put shock collars on their employees. True story.
In the city lights so grand and bright, billionaires were ruling the night with shock collars in their hands. Oh, they thought they had the upper hand.
Money is a form of power, but due mainly to the environmental crisis, it may not be long before that power crumbles, at least temporarily. And in fact, this potential future is something that many billionaires and multimillionaires are anticipating and fearing and trying to prepare for. And to get a little peek into how they are preparing, there's a great anecdote about this from a guy named Douglas Rushkoff, who, among other things, has written books on media technology and its impact on society. So, because of his expertise, in 2017, a group of billionaires in Silicon Valley invited him to come give a presentation on the future of the digital tech industry.
So I got on a plane, business class, warm nuts, the whole thing, and go out to the, I mean, they have warm, you've flown business class and warm nuts? Who thought,
yeah.
I'm still amazed. Who thought of that?
I'm also amazed. Like what do they actually do on this flight to keep your nuts warm? Is it heated seats, or do they give you a little blanket for your nuts? Or do the flight attendants keep your nuts warm manually? I just hope those flight attendants are getting well paid. I'm sure they're not, though.
I thought I was doing a talk, one of these these kind of high-priced talks for wealthy tech investors. And I'm sitting in the green room waiting to go on. And instead of miking me up and taking me out on a stage, these 5 men are escorted in. They sit around this table and start peppering me with all these questions about the future.
So at first, the billionaires are just asking him questions like, oh, what should we invest in? And Douglas is just like, I don't know. That's not within my expertise. But soon, their questions took a strange turn.
And then they got to New Zealand or Alaska. You know, where do I put my bunker? And they started asking me then these questions about surviving the apocalypse. Like, what do they do with their bunker? And how do they, protect themselves from this threat or that? Because they believed that this event was coming.
The event is a term that these billionaires were using to refer to a possible future catastrophe so extreme that they would want to flee from their mansions in Silicon Valley and retreat to their fortified bunkers that are equipped with luxuries like indoor pools and stocked with enough supplies to keep themselves sealed off from the world for decades.
Apparently, they had people do the statistical analysis, and they believed there was a 20% chance of the event occurring sometime before the end of their lives. And so they were taking 20% of their capital and investing it in surviving that event.
The event is approaching imminently. Wow, so what finally did it? Was it pandemic, nuclear war, climate crisis? Yes, that makes sense, actually.
I've gotten calls from lots and lots of people in interesting places. And one of them is a giant hedge fund, which is a hedge fund that's positioned for global calamity. Mm-hmm. You know, it's got a few $1 billion in there. And they showed me their PowerPoint with charts from the World Bank and the climatologists of this, and like, okay, in the next 10 years, these regions will become unlivable. 10 years after that, these ones will be the only ones that have fertile soil. This is why we recommend buying land in northern Canada, Siberia, Greenland, and this part of Antarctica. And it's like, oh my God.
So for these billionaires, their number one concern about surviving the event was how to protect themselves from other people, people who had lost everything and were desperately searching for food and supplies. And as they had told Rushkoff, they had already paid retainer fees to Navy SEALs to come and be their security team if and when the event finally comes.
And I said, yeah, well, are these Navy SEALs going to continue to protect you once their money's worthless? And they panicked. So these guys who think they're so friggin' brilliant, they're starting to jot down, figure out how to get Navy SEALs to cooperate after our money's worthless.
Quite the predicament. Reminds me of that scene from Titanic.
Had a deal, Captain. Any more women and children?
Your money can't save you any more than it could save me. Get back!
So that is the dilemma of the billionaire in the apocalypse. How do I maintain power when my money no longer gives me power? Specifically, how do I maintain power over my security guards? And they came up with an idea that, let's just say, is interesting.
So they were talking about, what if everyone on the compound had to have an implant, and then we could use the implant sort of as a shock collar, so that, as an advanced form of shock, so that it would ensure compliance.
Good old-fashioned slavery, a tale older than civilization itself. But, I thought these people in the tech industry are supposed to be innovative, and they're just repackaging the same old thing. Huh. Okay, no, that makes perfect sense. Never mind. Okay, so obviously the shock collar idea is the product of a mind severely deprived of basic empathy and compassion. But I guess, coming from a group of billionaires, that's not too shocking. Ha ha ha. But this idea is also the product of a mind severely deprived of common sense. I mean, you have a team of Navy SEALs, well-armed and well-trained, and you think your little shock collar is a match for that? You think they can't just blow your brains out the second your finger is removed from the shock button? You think they're even going to agree to get an implant in the first place? It's not going to go well for you, homie. I'm sorry. I think it's going to be a lot like that scene in The Dark Knight Rises.
Believers. No, you stay here. I'm in charge.
Do you feel in charge?
small fortune.
This gives you power over me. Your money and infrastructure have been important. Till now.
Oh, the billionaires never saw it coming. Shot collars no longer so stunning. In a twist of fate, the tables turned. The guards took aim and bridges burned.
So if civilization does actually collapse, bunkers are not going to be a source of salvation, right? The only thing that can really help you to avoid starvation or avoid, like, I don't know, having to sell yourself into slavery to some warlord in exchange for food, the only thing that can really help you to survive and to thrive is if you and others form like networks for support and mutual aid, right? So that, among other things, you can share and manage whatever resources are available locally, and also share and manage the resources that are available beyond the local level. Thankfully, there are many real-life examples of people doing exactly that. You know, examples that we can all learn from. And one of these real-life examples is what is called the commons. Though actually it's not just one example, because there are like, I don't know, thousands of commons all around the world. So I guess it's more accurate to say that a commons is one type of example. My previous video also focused on the commons, but in that one, I only really talked about the commons in these very general terms. Like, you know, I only gave a couple of specific examples of commons, and I just like really did not draw out the big, juicy, important lessons that there are to be learned from these examples. And trust me, there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and they are indeed big and juicy.
Warm nuts?
And important. So that's why these lessons are going to be a major focus of this video. And if you did not see the previous video, be thankful that your mind has not encountered this particular poison. Or if you just need your memory refreshed on what a commons is, here's a quick little definition from Michelle Bowens of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. A commons is
Warm nuts?
A commons is shared resources maintained or co-produced by a community or group of stakeholders, and it is managed according to the rules and values of that community. Okay, so if that definition still did not make things clear for you, just hang tight, because your understanding will become increasingly clear as we look at various examples of commons in this video. But for now, just remember that a commons is a resource or a resource-rich area that is shared by multiple people and managed by the people who share it. Managing or governing a commons, it involves the people who use a commons creating rules that they all agree to follow. And those rules are designed to ensure that they don't overuse or deplete their common resource, and also to ensure that they all contribute the work necessary to keep their common resource viable, thus preventing the free rider problem. And also the rules tend to ensure an egalitarian sharing of the resource. So in other words, the rules are meant to enable sustainability, fairness, and equality. Generally speaking, at least. And another key thing to remember is that the commons, well, not all of them, but many commons involve systems of management where people share power in a way that is egalitarian. So that is very different from the usual structures of management and governance in our society, where power and control is concentrated into the hands of a handful of elites.
Now, you're not naive enough to think we're living in a democracy, are you, buddy?
My primary source in this video is the book Governing the Commons by Elinor Ostrom, and I'm using it as my primary source for a couple of reasons. First, because it is widely considered one of the best texts about the commons. She wrote it after over 20 years of researching commons in various countries all around the world, and her work is so highly respected that in 2009, she won the Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences. But there's an even more important reason why I'm using this book as my primary source. It's because in this book, Ostrom, she does more than just document examples of commons in various countries. She actually analyzes each of these examples, both the successful ones and the failures, and she tries to figure out how and why each of them either succeed or fail. And what counts as a successful commons can be defined in various ways, but at minimum, it has to be a case where people use the common resource in a way that is both productive and sustainable, so that the resource does not deplete or degrade in like a tragedy of the commons type situation. So what Ostrom does in her book is to identify what practices and circumstances enable a commons to succeed, and also identify what practices and circumstances make success more difficult or are even the cause of failure. And information like this is gold. Like this information, we are so lucky that it has been documented and published and is out there for us to learn about, because it is going to be vital to our well-being and perhaps even to our survival. After all, there are multiple global environmental crises that threaten to cause societal collapse within our lifetime, causing governing institutions and economic supply chains to break down, which means that new institutions for governing society and managing the economy will need to be created. And I don't know about you, but I would rather live in the community where the water supply is actually used sustainably rather than drained down to nothing within a few years. And I also rather live in the community where we share and manage the water supply in a way that is egalitarian, so that we all basically get equal access to the amount of water that we get. And we're also, sharing the power that we have over the management of that water. That sounds much better to me than living in the community where the local warlord is in charge of the water supply and only lets us have some water if we agree to be his slave or be a soldier in his army or to rub his feet and suck his
warm nuts
or whatever it is that he wants from us.
To bow before, kneel before my feet, and then call me your daddy.
And if we want to prevent a community from being taken over by a warlord or by other people who want to dominate and exploit us, obviously it requires that we be able to defend ourselves with guns and weapons and fighting. But to defend ourselves, it's equally important that we have a well-organized community that is able to govern itself, especially when it comes to meeting people's needs for food and fuel and water and shelter and other basic necessities. Because if we fail to provide the things that people need to survive, most people are going to be willing to support anyone or anything that does provide them, even if those people are monsters. And furthermore, thinking now beyond the potentially approaching apocalypse and instead towards the brighter possibilities that may grow out of those ashes of ruin, or may even allow us to circumvent those ashes of ruin. If you hope for a future where the environment is not destroyed or degraded, but instead is able to flourish, and a future where economic resources are not controlled by either private owners or by a state, but are instead managed by people in an egalitarian way. If this type of future sounds good to you, then once again, it's important to understand how to govern a commons. Now, I really don't want to exaggerate anything, so let me just be very clear that I'm not trying to say that these are perfect examples of egalitarianism, or ideal examples of how to manage resources. It's just the petty bourgeoisie coming together to manage their resources in a lot of these cases is what's really going on. There's often this connection to capitalism and commerce that I reject. But despite that, these are still cases of people sharing and managing their use of scarce economic resources in a way that is sustainable and egalitarian. So that's why these cases are still worth learning from. In order to understand how to govern a commons successfully, we need to start with what comes first, right? We need to start with what it takes to get started. And by that, I mean how to begin from a situation where a commons is totally ungoverned and unmanaged and unruly. And from there, get everyone who uses the commons to come together as a group and begin to govern it. The challenge here is pretty much the same as it is in any form of organizing, right? Just how do you take a situation where everybody is only acting as individuals and is just doing their own thing to one where people are working together towards shared goals. What follows is not a step-by-step guide on how to get started, but it's a case study that will provide several valuable insights. Okay, let's go. Imagine that you're a farmer living in Sri Lanka, a poor farmer who only owns a little bit of land. and you water your crops with a common irrigation system that you share with other nearby farmers. And sometimes you and these other farmers have physically fought each other over the use of this water. And actually, there's even been the occasional murder. This conflict is due to the water being very scarce, and also due to the commons being very badly managed. And also the physical structure of the irrigation system is damaged. The canals are clogged with silt, and the banks of the canals are crumbling, and there are broken control structures and other physical damage that is causing the water in the irrigation system to not reach as large of an area as the system was designed to. Overall, things are nearly as dysfunctional as the government of, well, whatever country you happen to live in. I mean, don't worry, it's not quite that bad, but it's bad. Eventually, this commons became successful, but before it was a success, it was a hot mess, which is uplifting news for hot messes everywhere. Me included. And maybe you too. Not maybe, that sounds, I mean maybe as in like maybe you're a hot mess, maybe you're not maybe there's not hope for you. If there's hope for this hot mess situation, there's hope for us too. This hot mess situation was impacting tens of thousands of farmers in Sri Lanka, all of who shared a common irrigation system that was fed by the Gal Oya River and another one fed by the Kirindi Oya River. Gravity being what it is, the water must make its way down through the system, which means that the farmers who live upstream get to irrigate their crops before the farmers who live downstream. And wouldn't you know it, the farmers who live upstream, some of them abused this advantage to the detriment of those who lived downstream. Not very nice. You see, the farmers in this region were growing rice, and the thing about rice is that if you flood the farmland with excess water, the flooding will kill all of the weeds without hurting the rice. Now, if the farmers all shared the water equally, they'd all have enough water to grow the rice, but they wouldn't have enough water to kill the weeds, so they'd have to do the work of removing the weeds by hand. It's difficult, it's time-consuming, it's a figurative pain in the ass, and a literal pain in the back. The hell with that, said many of the upstream farmers, helping themselves to extra water. Oh no, you didn't, said the downstream farmers, who now had little to no water at all. Oh yes, we did, said the upstream farmers, shamelessly. And now you can see why the farmers sometimes had violent clashes. Our story now turns to the left bank division of the Gal Oya River Irrigation Project, an area with about 65,000 acres of land and 19,000 farmers. Things in this area were even worse than what I've been describing, because farmers in the upstream area were Sinhalese and farmers in the downstream area are Tamil. And in case you didn't know, these two ethnic groups, Sinhalese and Tamil, have a history of ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka that has at times been brutal and bloody. So yeah, let's just take an already volatile situation between upstream and downstream farmers and just throw a little ethnic conflict in the mix, as if things weren't bad enough. And yet it is here in the left bank of the Gal Oya River that this nightmare was radically transformed. The push that got this transformation rolling came from a project that was designed and funded, at pretty low cost, by the way, by the Rural Development Committee at Cornell University and an NGO called the Agrarian Research Training Institute. The project began in a 5,000-acre area, so just a small part of the region, but hey, they had to start somewhere. And it expanded pretty quickly. So it kicked off in the early 1980s, and then before the end of the decade had already expanded to 25,000 acres. So what they did was hire a bunch of people to go live amongst the farmers in the left bank of the Gal Oya and to work as what they called institutional organizers, or IOs for short. The goal of these IOs was not to try to convince the farmers to follow any particular set of policies, but rather to convince the farmers to work together to solve their own problems using their own strategies.
Instead of establishing a predefined organization, the IO tried to form a working committee to solve particular problems, such as repairing a broken control gate or desilting a field channel.
So the farmers began working in small groups to solve small problems, and this taught them a valuable lesson, that they are capable of working together and that by working together, they can fix problems that yesterday seemed unfixable. This was a lesson that they could only learn through experience, and it was this lesson that made them willing to take the next steps towards greater levels of organization and cooperation. So in the beginning, these small groups of farmers who worked together, it was all like really informal. But eventually, with the encouragement of the IOs, they began to recognize themselves as members of an actual organization. So these small groups became known as field canal organizations, and they have this name because their membership consists of all the farmers who share the same field canal in the irrigation system. So that's generally about 12 to 15 farmers who are all living nearby each other. So these are small local organizations, and most of them choose to operate pretty informally without any like regular meeting times or agendas or written records. Each field canal organization is autonomous and operates independently, but they're also all linked together and able to operate in a coordinated way. And the way they achieve this is as follows. Each field canal organization chooses one of its members to be a delegate, and this delegate then attends meetings with delegates from other field canal organizations. So at these meetings where all of the delegates come together, each delegate has the duty of articulating the ideas and issues and interests of the farmers of their own field canal organization, to basically be a messenger and advocate for their neighbors who are, sharing the same field canal. And then they come home and report back to their neighbors what happened at the meeting with all the other delegates. So those are the field canal organizations, which are at level 1 of the organizational structure. And eventually the farmers created a second level of organization called a distributory canal organization. And it was named that because its membership encompasses all the farmers who share the same distributory canal of the irrigation system, which is usually about 100 to 300 farmers. So each distributory canal organization has its own way of operating, but the usual pattern is that there is a general assembly consisting of all of the farmers who are sharing that distributory canal, plus there's a committee with just the delegates from all of the field canal organizations within that distributory canal area. So at this point, the farmers had created 2 levels of organization. There was the small and local field canal organizations, and then there was the larger distributory canal organizations. And every farmer belonged to both organizations. And eventually the farmers created a 3rd level of organization at an even larger scale. These are called area councils. The left bank of the Galoya River is divided into 4 areas, and so the farmers created 1 council for each area, 4 area councils. Now, at this scale, there are thousands of farmers living in each of the 4 areas, so it's not like all of the farmers can get together in one meeting. That would be too chaotic. So instead, the area council meetings are attended only by the delegates from the field canal organizations in that area. So that means that there are a few hundred delegates in each of the 4 area councils. And finally, the farmers created a 4th level of organization, the project level committee. And this is used as a forum for the farmers to take part in discussions about policy. As far as I can tell, this organization doesn't really have a rigid membership structure, but is pretty open to any farmer who takes the initiative to get involved. All these levels of organization aren't just for the hell of it. Their purpose is to enable the farmers to work together to achieve shared goals and solve shared problems, not just locally, but for the entire region. Being so well organized also gives them the power to advocate for their interests to the Sri Lankan government, and by doing so, they've managed to convince the irrigation department to make various policy changes in their favor. The beautiful thing about this is that by working together and cooperating to solve their problems, it did a lot to heal the hostility that had existed between the farmers. It created increasing levels of trust and camaraderie between them. And pretty soon, the upstream farmers were no longer taking more water than they were supposed to, and were instead sharing the water in a fair and equitable way. And they even went above and beyond this to make even more water available to the downstream farmers. Just to give one example of this, there was a distributory canal that was right at the boundary between a Sinhalese community upstream and a Tamil community downstream, and it had been years since any sort of maintenance had been done on this canal. So this area of the irrigation system was pretty messed up, But just a few months after the field canal organizations had been created, Sinhalese farmers from upstream and Tamil farmers from downstream, they began working together to clear out and clean out these canals. No one told them to do this. No one paid them to do this. They just did it. It took 3 long days, and it required things like chopping out tree roots with a handheld axe. So like hard labor. But they were willing to do it so that water from the irrigation system would finally reach the Tamil farmers downstream. This is like truly an impressive and heartwarming achievement, especially when you consider the fact that this is a community where there had been ethnic conflict and literal murders over water disputes. I mean, honestly, it's truly beautiful. The cooperation, I mean, not the murders. The irrigation water was now reaching 1,000 more acres and 300 more families. So, in other words, they improved the efficiency, productivity, and functionality of their common resource. Events like this, of farmers repairing and clearing out canals that had been dysfunctional and clogged, honestly, for years, became a fairly common occurrence after the farmers got organized. In fact, in a survey that was done before the field canal organizations were created, 80% of farmers said that canal cleaning was poor. 80%. But then, after the field canal organizations were created, only 6% of farmers still said that canal cleaning was poor. So that all being said, I really don't want to give like an exaggerated impression of how good the results were. Like, it's not like the left bank of the Galoya River just became totally free of problems. But it was radically transformed from a situation of conflict and even occasional violence to one of mutual support and cooperation. You know, from a system where stealing extra water was the norm to one where sharing water equitably is the norm. And from an irrigation structure that was busted up and more dysfunctional than your family reunion to one that was watering and irrigating thousands of more acres than it had been before. And from a system of negligent governance by the state to a commons of well-organized and well-functioning self-governance by the resource users. However, the fact cannot be avoided that this transformation was initiated by outside organizers, the IOs, who were hired as part of a project that was funded by a university and an NGO. So on the one hand, you can say that this self-governance relied on outside help. But on the other hand, all the IOs did was to get the ball rolling. After the initial boost of momentum, the farmers ran their organizations on their own. Now, don't get me wrong, the role of the IOs was extremely important. And I also don't have a problem with outsiders going into a community and helping people to get organized, right? If that's done well, it can be great. However, I don't see any insurmountable reason why the role of the IOs couldn't have been fulfilled by the farmers. You know, all it would have taken is for a few farmers in each community to just do the same thing that the IOs had initially done. So, you know, they would just have to go out to their own neighbors and encourage them to start working together as a small group, solving small local problems. And then, you know, to use the momentum of those victories to encourage larger networks of farmers to work together to solve larger problems beyond the local level. You know, all of that could have been done by the farmers. Okay, so now that I've made this point, I unfortunately need to walk it back a little bit, you know, not to negate it, but to give it a more humble framing. So part of the secret to the success of the IOs is that the IOs themselves were already organized, and also they were working in many different places simultaneously, many villages and many neighborhoods or communities within those villages. The reason this is helpful is because they were able to encourage many farmers to form local organizations in many communities at the same time. And then once that was done, the IOs that were in each community could just get in touch with each other and then use their connections with each other to help all the local organizations in all the different communities connect with each other too. And that made it a lot easier to form larger scale organizations at higher levels. If farmers had been trying to organize themselves from scratch without any help from the IOs, they would have found it more challenging to create so many different local organizations at around the same time, and then to connect all those local organizations together to form a larger scale organization. That totally could have been done. It just would have been, you know, more challenging. It really does help if there's an already existing organization that can work in communities and get things started, whether that be an organization that was launched by an NGO and university, as in this case, or it could be a more grassroots organization. Doesn't really matter. But anyways, regardless of all that, it was the IOs that got things moving, and then the farmers carried that momentum forward, and the results were great. But how were they able to achieve such great results? This is an important question to answer because within that answer are lessons to be learned for how to organize successful self-governance of a commons, or honestly just how to organize anything. So in my attempt to figure out their recipe for success, I've tried to identify the various features of their campaign that helped it to be so successful. And I'm going to list these not in any sort of order of importance, but in order of the sequence of events that occurred. Okay, here we go. Enabler of success number 1. The IOs, who from now on I will just call organizers, they were well suited to organize in this particular situation, right? So most of them were college graduates who had grown up on a farm and came from farmer families. So that means on the one hand, their farm background, obviously that's going to help them to connect with the farmers, and being college grads, that helped them to connect with the staff at the irrigation department, who they also had to interact with. Enabler of success number 2. The organizers received training. It was 6 weeks training in technical issues for farming and irrigation, and they also received training in how to approach the farmers to form that initial connection and relationship with them, and then also training in how to be good at motivating them. Enabler of success number 3. The organizers actually moved to the community that they organized in. So although they were newcomers to the community, the fact that they now lived there, it really helped the farmers to become familiar with the organizers and then also really to learn to trust them. Because they're no longer outsiders now, right? They're part of the community. Enabler of success number 4. The organizers met with each other on a regular basis to support each other and to learn from each other. As Ostrom explained it,
they were divided into small groups of 4 or 5. Each group responsible for the area served by one distributary canal. Each team divided its area into smaller units using field canals as the primary basis for division. Each group of IOs met weekly in order to learn from each other's experiences and bolster morale when necessary.
Enabler of success number 5. The organizers, they really took time to actually understand the farmers and their problems, and they did this first, before they even made any attempt to try to organize. And here's quoting Ostrom again.
An IO was expected first to meet each farmer sharing water from a field canal to discuss the types of agricultural and irrigation problems they faced, and to complete a survey of relevant information about the area.
So doing things this way had 2 benefits. Number 1 is that the farmers, they really got to know the organizers and see them as people who care about them and want to help them. And 2, the organizers gained knowledge and comprehension of the local conditions. And that is very important, right? Because there have just been countless cases of arrogant professionals who just think they know everything, yet they're just blunderingly ignorant about the community that they're trying to help. And therefore, they just end up being useless or even harmful. So yeah, getting to understand the local conditions really well first, that was important. Enabler of success number 6. So after getting to know the farmers and their problems, each organizer started by meeting with just a small group of farmers, the ones who all share the same field canal. So this was just a group of 15 people, and it was a really good starting point because it's relatively easy to organize such a small group of people. And it's good to start with something easy, get that momentum going. You start small and easy, and from there you build a strong base that can build to something bigger that's more complicated to organize. Enabler of success number 7. The small groups made small changes before attempting to organize on a larger scale. This was really important as a starting point, right? Because the farmers could then learn to trust each other and to trust that their efforts to make changes would not be wasted in failure. Right? Because when the farmers achieved success in small groups, it gave them confidence in their ability to work together, and it showed them that they can solve problems together as a group that they cannot solve alone. And this just naturally made them want to create an even bigger group to solve even bigger problems. Enabler of success number 8. The organizers did not impose or force solutions on the farmers, right? They just helped bring the farmers together so that the farmers could find their own solutions. In other words, they respected the farmers' autonomy, and they also helped the farmers to develop their autonomy. Enabler of success number 9. Measures were taken to avoid enabling any faction to have its own way while others did not. So in Sri Lanka, it's often the case that any organization that claims to serve or represent the people in general without privileging any group over others, instead it just ends up empowering a particular ethnic group or political party or some other faction. So to avoid recreating this dynamic, the farmer organizations usually did not make decisions by majority rules voting, right? Allowing decisions to pass if at least 51% of the members vote for it, right? Because if the majority can just have its own way on every vote, that would make it really easy for the ethnic group or political faction with the biggest population to just always get its own way. So to avoid this, the farmer organizations usually made decisions by consensus, and they always chose their delegates by consensus. Now, when decisions are made by consensus, that doesn't mean that everyone has to agree on a decision for it to pass, but everyone has to be at least willing to accept it, right? Because if anyone, even one person, decides that they are going to refuse to accept it, they can block the decision from being made. So using consensus for most of their decisions and using consensus to choose delegates, this approach seems to have achieved its desired results. As Ostrom wrote,
although keeping the organizations nonpartisan appeared to be difficult at the beginning, it was not unusual to find farmers from all parties holding offices in field canal organizations and distributory canal organizations and working well together.
Now, I should just say a word of caution about this because there are definitely pros and cons to using consensus decision-making, just as there are pros and cons to using majority rules decision-making. In fact, later in this video, we're going to discuss a point that Ostrom makes about why using consensus can actually make a commons more likely to fail rather than succeed. But which form of decision-making is best, it depends a lot on the particular details of that particular situation. And it seems that for this particular situation, for the farmers in Sri Lanka, consensus was the right way to go. Okay, so those are the 9 enablers of success from this case study. And I'm not saying that they're the only enablers of success or that they would be applicable and useful in any organizing situation, but I do think that they would be useful in a lot of cases. So let's just quickly review what they are. 1. Organizers were well suited to organize in this particular situation. 2. Organizers received training. 3. Organizers became part of the community. 4. Organizers supported and learned from each other. 5. Organizers took time to understand farmers and their problems before attempting to organize. 6. Each organizer started by meeting with a small group of farmers. 7. Small groups made small changes before attempting to organize on a larger scale. 8. Organizers did not attempt to impose solutions. They brought farmers together so they could find their own solutions. 9. Measures were taken to avoid enabling any faction to have its way while others did not. Okay, so there you have it. That's 9 lessons for how to organize people to start self-governing a commons. And next we will look at some more information which offers a few more insights towards achieving this goal. When you're trying to organize the self-governing of a commons, you need to convince people to show up to meetings. And also to follow rules that restrict and limit their use of the commons, like by restricting how much water you take from a common irrigation system, or restricting the number of cows you graze on a common pasture. And this restriction is important so that the common resource is not overused and thus depleted, degraded, or destroyed. And you also need to convince people to do the work that keeps the commons in good condition, like when the Sri Lankan farmers did the hard work of clearing out the clogged irrigation canals. So to put it bluntly, you need to convince people to make sacrifices. To sacrifice their time that it takes to go to the meetings, or sacrifice their sneaky stealing of irrigation water, or of whatever the common resource happens to be. You're asking people to take action, and although these actions will bring benefits, the benefits of a flourishing and well-managed commons, the fact is that these actions will also have consequences. So what you need to do is to show people that the costs of their actions will be outweighed by the benefits. Achieving this goal is not always easy, but thankfully, Ostrom has some useful insights to help us succeed at this goal. Insight number 1. Most people feel more motivated to avoid harm and loss than they do to achieve gains and benefits. For example, most people would do more to avoid losing $100 than they would to gain $100. Because of this tendency, Ostrom says,
one should expect individuals to be willing to adopt new rules that will restrict their appropriation activities when there are clear indicators of resource degradation, generally perceived to be accurate predictors of future harm, or when leaders are able to convince others that a crisis is impending.
And by restrict their appropriation activities, Ostrom means restrict their use of the resources in the commons. But yeah, the point here is that people are usually more willing to restrict themselves if they're worried about what they're going to lose if they don't restrict themselves. As an organizer, when you're attempting to show people that the benefits of something are going to outweigh the costs, it might help if you just take this same message and, just frame it a little bit differently. So instead of saying that the benefits are going to outweigh the costs, you could say that the costs of not taking action will be much higher and much worse than the costs of taking action. In other words, the focus is put on the fear of loss rather than the hope for gain. Now, this is not going to work for everyone, right? Personally, I feel a lot more moved and motivated by the idea of making the world a better place than the fear of it becoming worse and trying to stop that from happening. Honestly, I don't even really like the idea of emphasizing the fear of loss over the potential for gain. I don't really like to be sort of fear-based in how I motivate people. That's just me. However, the tendency to weigh potential losses more heavily than potential gains, that does seem to be a pretty frequent psychological disposition. There's quite a lot of research showing that to be true. So I don't know, I guess we should acquiesce to it to some degree at least, or at least be mindful of it. I'm not too happy about it, but maybe you could do both. You could, talk about the potential benefits and so on, but also talk about, try to get people afraid of what they'll lose if they don't act. So another insight that we can draw from insight number 1, so it's an insight within an insight, insightception or something, is that when it comes to organizing people to self-govern a commons, try to keep the costs low. And I mean costs in the broader sense of the term, so not just money, but also costs in terms of people's time and so on. Try not to ask too much of people, try to for example, keep meetings to a minimum, and make sure that the meetings are focused on achieving a goal and aren't just wasting time in endless talking. It's okay to have long meetings if that's what's necessary, but there needs to be some sort of payoff, right? Some sort of productive outcome so that people don't just feel oh, I've had my time wasted, right? That it was just this sunk cost. Insight number 2, most people feel more motivated by impacts that come immediately than they do by impacts that are going to come in the future. Unfortunately, when it comes to governing the commons, because this often entails convincing everyone to restrict their use of resources, the benefits, although they do outweigh the costs, can take quite a while before they actually pay off. And meanwhile, the costs are felt immediately. So as an organizer, it's good to try to create some benefits or victories quite early on, and then try to put a spotlight on them, right? To make sure that everyone hears about them. That, for example, is what was done by the Sri Lankan farmers when they started off in small groups achieving small goals. So they very quickly experienced some payoffs from their organizing, right? It was small payoffs at first, but that's what helped them to gain motivation to continue to organize further. Insight number 3, most people feel more motivated to act based on recent events rather than long-term trends. As Ostrom put it,
individuals are apt to weigh recent events more heavily than events more distant in a long history of experience. One should expect rule changes to be made after a series of relatively bad yields from a common pool resource, but not to be made after a series of relatively good years.
So basically, if you're trying to organize people to start governing a commons that is currently ungoverned, the best time to get started is during the time that the commons is in its worst condition. So if the common resource is water, then you'll probably have an easier time organizing if there has recently been a drought. So, strike while the iron is hot, or while the riverbank is dry. But hey, if it's only been good times in recent memory, don't worry. Things will get bad soon enough. Okay, but seriously, if things have been good for a while, it does help to show people records of long-term statistical trends. That way they can all see for themselves that just because there's been a few good years recently doesn't mean that things aren't going to head downhill unless changes are made soon. So there you go, some more advice on how to get people organized and motivated to start governing a commons that is currently ungoverned. But remember that these tips do not apply to everyone because everyone's psychology is different. And if you want even more organizing tips, there's a good training program offered for free by the IWW, aka the Industrial Workers of the World, aka the Wobblies. Now, this training program is geared towards workplace organizing, and of course that is very, very valuable in and of itself, but also the lessons that it has are valuable for any type of organizing. So check online to see if there's an IWW branch in your city, and ask about their Organizer 101 training so that you can learn to organize your workplace and do all sorts of organizing for revolutionary purposes. And another learning resource that you can check out is my video, which I've linked below in the video description, called How to Grow a Movement: Tips for Activists and Organizers, which, as you can guess from the title, has some tips for activists and organizers. So when it comes to governing a commons, we've looked at some important information for how to get started. But that's just the beginning. And even though that's probably the hardest part of it, there's still a chance that things could fail going forward. So the question is, how do we make a commons a success? But before we talk about success, we should talk about a topic that I'm unfortunately much more familiar with: failure. Yay. When the people who use a commons attempt to self-govern that commons, they're not always successful. Sometimes the common resource is depleted or degraded, which then causes all of the resource users to suffer because the resource that they rely on is now less available or of lower quality. Plus, there's also the harm that's done to the environment, and of course this has really bad consequences for all of the local animals and other forms of life. There are many reasons why people's attempts to govern a commons may fail, but for now, I just want to focus on one particular reason that keeps coming up again and again and again. At least in the modern era, it's probably the most common reason for a commons to fail, and yet it's very uncommon for people to talk about it or acknowledge it. So you're probably wondering what this reason is, and to explain it, let's just quickly return to the classic tragedy of the commons parable that we discussed in the previous video, and I'll just do a quick recap of it here. The Tragedy of the Commons is the title of an essay by Garrett Hardin, and in this essay, Hardin told a little story, an entirely fictional story, by the way.
Wow, the land of make-believe!
About farmers in a village who graze their cows in a common pasture. And each farmer wants to add extra cows because they're like, oh, I'll get more milk and therefore more money, and it won't do much harm because it's just one extra cow. A very small cost to the pasture, but a very big gain for me. But eventually, the farmers get too many cows for the pasture to handle, and so the pasture degrades until, next thing you know, there's not enough grass for all the cows. And so now the cows are starving and producing less milk, and that's bad for the cows, obviously, and bad for the humans. Bad for everyone.
Ah, shit!
Hardin calls this terrible, ruinous outcome the tragedy of the commons, and he blames it on the commons itself, on the fact that the pasture is shared by everyone in the village. But there's another factor that Hardin is not acknowledging. Although the land is shared by the community, the cows are owned by individuals. The cows are private property. And that's where things go wrong. And if you feel like you've heard this already, it's because, yes, I did make this point in the previous video, but if you just bear with me for another minute or two while I go over the point again for those who didn't hear it last time or forgot about it, I'm then going to expand on the point by applying it to real-world examples. So if the cows were not private property, but were instead shared by the community, then no farmer could monopolize the gains of adding an extra cow. You could no longer get all the gains to yourself while sharing the costs of the damage to the pasture with every other farmer. Now the gains and the costs are shared equally by everyone. So adding an extra cow would no longer give you even a temporary net gain. There would be an immediate net loss, not just for the group, but for you too. As a result, no farmer would be tempted to add any more cows than the pasture can handle. So Hardin's tragedy of the commons is actually a tragedy of private profit. Or I guess you could also call it the tragedy of privately owned economic resources, which is accurate, but, doesn't really have the appeal of being a nice, snappy catchphrase. The tragedy occurs because each person is only profiting off of their own cows. So based on pure economic self-interest, they have no reason to give a damn about anyone else's cows, or whether they're eating less grass or producing less milk. Not my cows, not my problem. That's the attitude. But if all the cows belong to everyone, then everyone is going to care about the productivity of all the cows. The lesson here is that if we had an economic system where there was no private ownership of economic resources, then it would be way less likely for a commons to fail. Though just to be clear, it's already not that likely for a commons to fail. I'm just saying it would be even less likely. And also, we should liberate the cows. They really should not be anyone's property. No human, no cow, no animal of any kind should be property. But that's another story.
He was a scrawny calf who looked rather woozy. No one suspected he was packing an Uzi. Cows with guns. They came with a needle to stick in his thigh. He kicked for the groin. He pissed in their eye. Cow well hung. He picked up a bullhorn and jumped up on the hay. We are free-roving bovines. We run free today.
In Elinor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, she gives a few examples of commons that are failing, that are experiencing what you might call a tragedy of the commons situation. But in each of these cases, you could probably better describe it as a tragedy of private profit. For example, Ostrom talks about these two commons that are both inshore fisheries in Turkey. One fishery is in the coast of the city of Bodrum. The other is in the Bay of Izmir. So, two common fisheries, and both of them have too many fishers, too many boats, too many nets, too many people trying to catch a limited supply of fish. In earlier times, these fishing sites were not overcrowded, but they got more and more crowded over the course of the 20th century until eventually the amount of fish that people were catching declined and the amount of money they were making declined too. Each fisher is pursuing their own private profit, and this creates a situation where they have competing and conflicting economic self-interests. The more fish that one of them catches, the less fish are left for everyone else, and each new boat that enters the harbor makes the situation worse. But think how things would change if the commons wasn't just the fishery, right? Like the shore or the bay where the fishers do their fishing, but if the commons was expanded to include all of the fishing boats and all of the fishing nets and all of the other fishing equipment, and also if all of the fish they caught were common property too. Now, again, I don't think that fish should be property of any type, because they're animals, right? They're living and sentient creatures. But I'm trying to make a point about the economics of the situation, so I'm just going to ignore the ethics. So if this was the case that the commons was expanded to include all of the economic resources that are involved in fishing, that would mean that the fishers would be sharing all of the economic costs and all of the economic gains of fishing. So that would also mean that they would be sharing the profits that they all make in an equitable way. And one example of how they could do that is like by sharing the profits in proportion to the amount of time that each person spends working. This would put an end to the economic competition between fishers because their own economic success would now depend on the success of the group, which means that they would no longer have any incentive to add more nets or boats than the fishing site could sustain. It was economic competition that was sabotaging the situation, so by removing the economic competition, they remove the sabotage and the problem is solved. But actually, although this is an improvement, I still think that this scenario is far from ideal because it only removes economic competition between the fishers in these particular fisheries. But this just really is not good enough because there's still going to be economic competition with fishers in different locations in different regions. There's still going to be competition between different industries. And there's still going to be the profit motive. And as we have discussed in the previous video and many other videos, the profit motive has a very corrupting and negative influence. So to improve things even further, imagine a society where all of the economic costs and economic gains of the entire fishing industry and all of the economic costs and economic gains of every industry are shared by society as a whole. In this society, the fish that the fishers catch are not sold for profit. Instead, the fishers simply give their fish away to whoever wants them. And the fishers don't mind doing this because they live in a society where they don't need to sell things for profit in order to pay for food or housing or internet or squishmallows or any other good or service. And they don't need to do this because in this society, it's not just them, the fishers, that give their products away without selling them for profit. Every single enterprise in every single industry also gives their products away like this. And furthermore, the fishers don't pay for any of their business costs, right? So they don't pay for like any boats or nets or any other costs of production. And that's how it is in every industry. No enterprise in any industry has to pay for its cost of production. And that's because in this society, all of the economic costs and all of the economic gains of every industry are shared by society as a whole. And it's done this way despite the fact that this is a society with no state. And when I say there is no state, by that I mean that there is no government that like coercively enforces a hierarchy of domination, not even if this hierarchy of domination is chosen through elections to give it a pathetic illusion of democracy.
Now, you're not naive enough to think we're living in a democracy, are you, buddy?
Okay, so I know that that description of that society was like a lot to take in. It was like a big, vague, and underexplained dump of information, and it raises 1,000 questions. And I really don't expect anyone to be convinced by such a shabby explanation that a society like that is possible or desirable. But if you're curious and you want to know more about it, you can check out my video, Post-Capitalism, a detailed look at how it could work, and you can find a link for that in the video description. But anyways, even if that description of a society with a new and different economic system didn't really make sense to you, the point is that the tragedy of the commons is way, way easier to avoid if we expand the commons to include all of the means of production and if we put an end to competition for profit. I hope that we can one day make the necessary changes to create a world like this. And I also hope for a world where the vast majority of humans no longer kill or eat fish or any other animal, with the exception of the humans who live in hunter-gatherer societies, because their way of life and culture is very much dependent on hunting. And also, at least the animals get to live a free life before they're killed, rather than being kept in prisons where they experience misery and suffering and never get to know a single day of freedom, which is what we do to them. So those two fisheries in Turkey that we were just discussing, they are both examples of commons that are failing. But it's important to note that it's not just the fishers who are failing to govern that commons successfully. The government is also involved in trying to govern that commons, so the government shares the responsibility for the failure. But anyways, Ostrom also writes about another common fishing site on the shore of another city in Turkey, the city of Alanya. Ostrom classifies this case as fragile, which means that although it's currently succeeding, she considers there to be, a situation going on that basically could jeopardize that success in the near future. But for now, things are going well. But it wasn't always going well, as Elinor Ostrom put it.
The early 1970s were the dark ages for Alanya.
The problem is that in this fishery, different areas of the fishery were not all equally good for catching fish. So some spots were really good, some spots were not so good. So every day the fishers would be clamoring and competing to get a good spot. This intense competition between the fishers caused intense hostility between them, and sometimes even physical fights.
Ricky! Pull it! Get it to him! Stop it! Oh! Get out of there!
And all of this time and energy that they had to put into competing with each other was actually increasing their production costs, which means that these poor bastards were getting punched in the face and in the pocket. Eventually, the fishers decided that they really had to do something to fix this terrible situation. So they all came together and had meetings to try to figure out how to make things right. And they didn't get things right on their very first try. So pretty early on, they came up with a set of rules and procedures and they tried them out. And then, they found out what was working, what wasn't working. And they kept evolving those procedures over time, changing them to improve them, until eventually, after more than a decade of trial and error, they figured out a set of procedures and rules that were ideal for their circumstances. And here's how Elinor Ostrom describes what they finally came up with.
Each September, a list of eligible fishers is prepared, consisting of all licensed fishers in Alanya. Within the area normally used by Alanya fishers, all usable fishing locations are named and listed. These sites are spaced, so that the nets set in one site will not block the fish that should be available at the adjacent sites. These named fishing locations and their assignments are in effect from September to May. In September, the eligible fishers draw lots and are assigned to the named fishing locations. From September to January each day, each fisher moves east to the next location. After January, the fishers move west. This gives the fishers equal opportunities at the stocks of fish that migrate from east to west between September and January and reverse their migration through the area from January to May.
It really is a great rotation system that they came up with. They space the fishers far enough apart that they're not going to disrupt the flow of the fish and thus not cod block each other's productivity. See what I did there? Cod block?
What?
It's a joke.
Right.
And another benefit of this rotation system is that it gives each boat an equal chance to get a good fishing spot, and nobody has to waste their time looking for a fishing spot or literally fight for one.
That's what I'm talking about.
So clearly, these fishers are doing a good job at governing their commons, but as I was reading about it, even though I was really impressed that they came up with such a well-designed and elaborate set of procedures and rules, I just couldn't help but think that going to all of this trouble just would not have been necessary if they were working within an economic system that was not based on markets and profit and competition. But because these fishers are working within a market economy that is inherently profit-driven and competitive, each one of them is only concerned with their own profit. This is why each one of them wants to monopolize the best spots, all for themselves. It's why they were fighting over the best spots, and it's why they had to come up with this elaborate scheme just in order to share the spots and stop fighting. And if you learn about other successful examples of commons, you see the same pattern again and again and again. Elaborate and painstakingly designed rules that are meant to minimize the harmful effects of competition and the profit motive. But minimizing and managing these harmful effects can be as difficult as taming a rabid and ravenous beast.
Oh, Jesus, what the fuck?
And so, unfortunately, but Unsurprisingly, these efforts don't always succeed, and the chances of failure increase when the temptation of the profit motive is particularly intense. And this can be seen in the tragic and true story of what happened to tortoises in Madagascar. Meet the radiated tortoise. They live in southern Madagascar's spiny forest, which is kind of the best name for a forest that I've ever heard. And their main sources of food are grass, fruit, and succulent plants. Succulent. But their favorite food is
warm nuts.
The opuntia cactus. They can live up to 50 years of age, which, by the way, is longer than former US President John F. Kennedy. Impressive.
Back and to the left.
The radiated tortoise was once the most abundant tortoise species in the whole world, with a population in the millions. But now they're a critically endangered species, which means that they are at high risk of going extinct in the near future. The change came in the late 20th century when all of a sudden a lot of people started to want radiated tortoises as pets. So that increased international demand for radiated tortoises. And also locally, there was suddenly an increase in demand for tortoise meat. So this was like a classic supply and demand thing where there was a sudden increase in demand for the tortoises and therefore a sudden increase in the price that these tortoises were selling for. So suddenly a lot more people were wanting to get involved in selling them because they knew they could make more money. The result was a huge and sudden upsurge in killing these tortoises for their meat and kidnapping them to sell as pets. In a market system, goods that are in short supply are worth more money. So one of the really perverse things about this situation is that as the population of the tortoises declines, this just increases the price that they can be sold for and therefore creates an even stronger economic incentive to keep hunting them to extinction. Behold, the glory of the market. In a chapter of a book called The Drama of the Commons, legal scholar Carol M. Rose wrote the following about the radiated tortoise situation. Because of the suddenness and unexpectedness of this demand, perhaps reminiscent of the European demand for beaver furs several centuries ago in northern Canada, local peoples seem to have had insufficient time to develop customs or norms that might withstand the onslaught or that might contain their own contribution to it. Historical and contemporary examples suggest that CBMR practices, and by the way, by CBMR, she means community-based management regime, or in other words, the regime that resource users create to manage or govern their commons. Okay, so back to the quote. CBMR, or community-based management regime practices, are not capable of containing unexpected waves of commercial demand for resources not previously considered important or scarce to the community members. The terrible overhunting of Madagascar tortoises is one example. The decimation of sandalwood in early post-contact Hawaii is another. The historic overtrapping of beaver in the Canadian North is perhaps a third. In all these cases, and in others as well, outside commercial demand devastated environmental resources that were nominally in control of a community. Indeed, community members were recruited to participate in the decimation. So there you go. In all of these cases, the tragedy of the commons was driven by the tragedy of our profit-driven economy. Okay, enough about tragedy and failure. I really don't want to dwell on that any more than I have to. I already get enough of it in my own life. So let's move on.
Warm nuts.
Walnuts in my hand, can't stop the hustle. A better world ahead, out the struggles, muscle.
Warm nuts.
Walnuts in my hand, can't stop the hustle. A better world ahead, out the struggles, muscle.
In Chapter 1 of Governing the Commons, Elinor Ostrom writes,
Some individuals have broken out of the trap inherent in the commons dilemma, whereas others continue remorsefully trapped into destroying their own resources. This leads me to ask what differences exist between those who have broken the shackles of a commons dilemma and those who have not.
In her book, Ostrom analyzed case studies of various commons, and she looked for patterns in the successful and unsuccessful cases. As a result of this analysis, she discovered 7 features that existed in every single one of the successful cases. Plus, she found an 8th feature that was present in successful commons that were large or used by a large population. So the successful cases in her book had all of these features, but for the unsuccessful cases, they had as few as 0 of these features, and the most that they ever had was 3 of these features. This is decent evidence that these features are useful in helping to achieve success in governing a commons. Now, I wouldn't quite say that they're like a map that can, guide you straight to success, but they do give you a clue of what direction to take. So let's have a look at what they are. And by the way, Ostrom called these features the design principles. Design principle number 1, clearly defined boundaries. This means that it needs to be very clear what the physical and geographic boundaries are for the common resource. So, you should be able to draw an actual boundary around the commons on a map. And also, it needs to be very clear what the social boundaries are for the commons. So in other words, who is allowed to use the common resource. A commons is called a commons because it is common to, or shared by, multiple people. But the question with any commons is, common to who? So if the commons is a lake, who is the lake common to? Is it everyone in a 30-mile radius from the lake, or everyone in a 50-mile radius, or what? If a resource is common to literally everyone, just like anyone in the whole world can go use that resource, you, me, your mom, your grandma, whatever, then that is what's known as an open access commons. But if a resource is common only to particular people or a particular community or communities, then that's called a limited access commons. A commons is much more likely to be successful when it is a limited access commons than it is if it is an open access commons, or if there's just not clearly defined boundaries at all about who is allowed to use the common resource, which just means that it ends up kind of being an open access commons by default. So anyways, that is design principle number 1, clearly defined boundaries. But the question is, why does this help a commons to succeed? That's because if no limits are placed on who can use a resource, if just anyone from anywhere can just show up and use it, then it's much more likely for that common resource to be overused and depleted. The classic example of this is ocean fisheries, where overfishing is so severe that fish populations have drastically declined over the decades. And similar things can happen in inshore fisheries too, so fisheries that are fairly close to the coast, like what happened in those 2 fisheries in Turkey, in the Bay of Izmir and the coast of Bodrum. The number of people fishing in these fisheries rose higher and higher, which caused the income that fishers make to fall lower and lower, because there are too many fishers trying to catch a limited number of fish. Now, I feel like I should just come out and tell you that this design principle, it makes me uncomfortable. I'm fine with it being applied to commons that currently exist in the world, but when I think about the kind of economic system that I think will make the world a better place, I'm not really comfortable with a design principle where a group of people are claiming exclusive control over economic resources and excluding everyone else. For one thing, this can create serious economic inequalities between communities because some geographic areas have an abundance of resources and others just don't. But on the other hand, I also see the value in this design principle, right? Because open access commons, they're just more likely to fail, like what is the case for ocean fisheries. So this is a complicated issue, but I think it's an issue that can be resolved. As we saw earlier, the tragedy of the commons is to a great extent driven by the tragedy of private profit and the tragedy of economic competition. So if we got rid of capitalism, which is driven by profit and by competition, and we replaced it with an economic system that is neither profit-driven nor competition-driven, then it would become much easier for us to prevent tragedy of the commons type situations, even in an open access commons. I'm not saying it would be easy, but it would definitely be easier by a long shot. But even then, it may still be necessary in many cases to have clearly defined boundaries on who can and cannot use economic resources in particular locations. I mean, this is at least going to be necessary when it comes to having clear boundaries about who is responsible for managing resources. Whether to extend that to who is allowed to use certain resources is another question, but I don't know. Maybe there's going to be cases where that is important to have that restriction. But if that is the case, then it's very important for there to be sharing from the resource-rich communities to the resource-poor communities so that any sort of economic inequality based on geographic location is roughly equaled out. I'm not advocating for this to be done through some sort of like top-down, hierarchical, coercive governing structure. I'm advocating for voluntary sharing between self-governing communities. If this all sounds like something you would like to see in the future, but you're not sure if or how it could possibly work, then you might want to check out my video, Post-Capitalism, a detailed look at how it could work, which I'm now mentioning for the second time, shameless self-promoter that I am. And you may have noticed that like every video I do now is basically like a long promotional video for my post-capitalism video. So I hope that's okay with you. I hope that hasn't become annoying. And if it has, well...
Hey, I'm really sorry.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm really sorry too.
But anyways, that is design principle number 1. A commons should have clearly defined physical boundaries and clearly defined social boundaries of who can use it. And now let's have a look at design principle number 2. Rules are a good fit for local conditions, and they provide each resource user with benefits that are proportional to contribution. So you may have noticed there are like 2 things going on here, that this design principle has basically 2 parts to it. Rules are a good fit for local conditions is one part, and rules provide each resource user with benefits that are proportional to contributions is another part. Now I've put it into my own words, but each part comes from a different one of Ostrom's books, and they're both categorized as design principle number 2 for some reason. In Governing the Commons, Ostrom identifies design principle number 2 as follows.
Congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions. Appropriation rules restricting time, place, technology, and/or quantity of resource units are related to local conditions and to provision rules requiring labor, material, and/or money.
So basically, the rules need to be a good fit for the local conditions. And this is something that we already discussed quite a lot in the video that I released just before this one, so I won't repeat that discussion here. But the main thing to remember is that rules are only going to be effective if they are a good fit for the local environment, the local culture, the local economy, and for the characteristics of the resource itself. And those particular characteristics are often changing depending on what the local conditions actually are. A forest in one location is not going to be the same as a forest in another location. So that's how design principle number 2 is described in the book that Ostrom published in 1990. But then in 2013, there came along another book that Ostrom co-authored called Working Together, Collective Action, the Commons, and Multiple Methods in Practice. And this book says that Principle 2 had been, quote, slightly revised to improve the clarity, end quote. And so here's the updated version.
Proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. Rules in use should allocate benefits associated with a common pool resource in proportion to contributions of required inputs.
As far as I can tell, this 2013 version of design principle number 2 is a lot more than just slightly revising to improve clarity. I mean, it's clearly just like a straight up change in meaning, but whatever, I'm not going to contradict a Nobel Prize winner. Oh wait, I just did. What you gonna do? What you gonna do, Ostrom? You gonna come at me? I'll fight you and the whole Nobel Prize committee. Bring it on. You dead. You can't do shit about it. Okay, don't say that. Don't say that. That's not nice. It's not nice to challenge the dead to a fight. I actually kind of want to fight the Nobel Prize Committee already because they keep giving the Nobel Peace Prize to war criminals, and somebody needs to put a stop to that. Hey, maybe if I commit some war crimes when I beat their ass, they'll give me the Nobel Peace Prize. Yeah. So the revised design principle number 2 is all about making sure there's a balance between what people get and what they give, what they receive and what they contribute. In most commons, everyone who uses the commons has the right to receive an equal amount of its resources or equal access to its resources. And likewise, everyone has an equal responsibility to contribute to the commons. And contributing to the commons usually involves contributing to its upkeep and maintenance, like when the farmers in Sri Lanka worked together to repair their common irrigation system. A typical example of a commons where the contributions given and the benefits received are both equalized comes from Torbel, a village in Switzerland. Once a year, the villagers cut down some trees from the common forest so that they can use them as timber. And I'll let Ostrom describe how they do that.
The first step is that the village forester marks the trees ready to be harvested. The second step is that the households eligible to receive timber form work teams and equally divide the work of cutting the trees, hauling the logs, and piling the logs into approximately equal stacks. A lottery is then used to assign particular stacks to the eligible households.
Notice how careful they are in trying to make sure that every household receives an equal stack of timber. It's not just that they try to make each stack an equal size, but they even distribute the sacks by lottery. Stacks, not sacks. They're not like ball sacks. But they're also distributing the stacks by lottery. It's kind of like when a parent gives their kids a cupcake to split, and then they let one kid cut the cupcake, but then, just in case that kid is like, maybe I'll cut myself a little extra. That's not happening because it's the other kid who gets to choose the piece, which means that trying to cut more for yourself is just going to backfire. So everyone must give equally, and everyone receives equally, or at least receives equal access. That is the norm in most commons. However, there are some commons where there are differences in how much people contribute. And in commons like this, it's usually the case that how much a person contributes will determine how much they receive. So the people who give more receive more, and the people who give less receive less. But these differences are proportional. So like if you're giving about 10% more, you will receive about 10% more and not 20 or 50 or 1,000% more, but also not just 2 or 3% more either. So that is design principle number 2. And again, we turn to the question, why does this help a commons to succeed? Here's what Ostrom and her colleagues say in their 2013 book, Working Together.
Rules that respect proportionality are more widely accepted as equitable. Perceived inequity may lead some participants to refuse to abide by rules they consider to be unfair.
If rules don't feel fair, then people are not going to want to follow them. That is the core principle that is at work here. And I think that it's important to point out that for rules to feel fair, they don't necessarily need to create proportionality or a balance between giving and receiving. There are cases where people might feel that it's fair for the amount received to be determined not by how much you give, but by how much you need. Most of us feel that way about healthcare. We don't mind that cancer patients use more resources of the healthcare system than most people because we realize that they have a need for extra resources. And likewise, most of us don't think that the amount of medical services someone is entitled to should be based on how much they pay, which means most of us are at odds with health insurance executives and others who feast and profit on misery. Healthcare is not the only thing where most people have this attitude of to each according to their need. This is the usual attitude that people have towards any public good, like libraries, fire department services, and the use of roads and sidewalks. Nobody is telling anyone that they have less of a right to walk down the street because they don't pay enough taxes, though, probably PragerU will come out with a video about that at some point. I think that this attitude that most of us already have towards healthcare, that what a person receives should be not based on what they contribute, but based on what they need. I think it could be really beneficial to humanity if we expanded this attitude to encompass many more goods and services, or maybe even all of them. Now, I don't know if you've heard this before, but there have been a few political philosophers here and there who advocate for society where goods and services are all distributed according to need. To each according to their need. I don't know if you've encountered that idea before in your life, but can't say it was me that came up with it. It's been floating around for a while. Whoa. Of course, something like that is only going to work if the vast majority of people are actually happy with this and feel that it's fair and don't feel resentful about it, but see it in a positive way. What each person perceives as fair is subjective, and I'm not saying there's no sort of innate sense of morality regarding fairness, but there's also a lot of influence from social norms, cultural conditioning, and each person's individual psychology. Now, that being said, there may actually be limits on how far we can expand this to each according to their needs form of distribution of economic resources before a significantly large portion of people do start to feel that it is unfair. But what those limits actually are, or whether they even exist, is something that we just don't know. We really just don't know whether there even would be a significantly large portion of people who would feel it's unfair, under the right circumstances. We don't know that. But we also don't know that there wouldn't be. I don't think that's something that we can predict. And I don't really want to assume that it would be one way or the other. Because, there's really just no way to know unless, we actually try. But anyways, that was design principle number 2. The rules are a good fit for the local conditions. That's what is emphasized in the book Governing the Commons. And they provide each resource user with benefits that are proportional to their contribution. That's what is emphasized in the book Working Together. Design principle number 3. The people who must follow the rules are the people who make the rules. When it comes to the rules for using and managing a common resource, the resource users make their own rules. And they have the power to change those rules too. And they make and change those rules together as a group. In contrast to this, there are also shared or common resources where the rules about using those resources are instead made by the government or by a government agency. And there are also commons where the rules are made by a select few of the resource users who are elite members of the community. But commons like these, they tend to be less likely to succeed than commons where all of the resource users have input into making the rules. So why does it help a commons to succeed if it's the resource users who make their own rules? There are at least 3 reasons. Reason number 1 relates to something that we already talked about. Rules are only going to be effective if they're a good fit for the local conditions, so the local environment, local economy, and local culture. This means that whoever makes the rules needs to be knowledgeable about these local conditions. Otherwise, they just can't make rules that are a good fit. And it just so happens that resource users are very knowledgeable about local conditions due to the fact that they live nearby the resource and also use it. And that, my friends, is why resource users tend to do a good job at designing effective rules for their commons. Reason number 2. If resource users make their own rules, they're more likely to perceive those rules as fair. And if they perceive the rules as fair, they're more likely to want to follow them. And before we get to reason number 3, here's a quote from Elinor Ostrom commenting on reasons number 1 and 2.
The tendency of government officials to try to impose uniform rules throughout a jurisdiction, rather than specialized rules that apply to localities within a jurisdiction, makes it extremely difficult for such officials to set up and enforce rules that will seem effective and fair to local appropriators.
Sorry to interrupt Ostrom's quote, but I just wanted to mention that when Ostrom uses the term appropriators, she means resource users. So local appropriators means the local people who use the resources of a commons. Okay, back to the quote.
Trying to get local appropriators to commit themselves to follow rules that are perceived to be ineffective and inequitable is difficult. And the costs of monitoring and enforcing such rules are bound to be higher than for rules crafted by participants to fit local circumstances.
All right, and finally, reason number 3, if resource users as a whole don't make their own rules, if instead the rules are being made by local elites, then it's quite likely that those elites are going to make the rules to benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else. This has been shown in various research studies, though you probably did not need a research study to tell you that. I mean, that's how our own world operates, so not a shock at all.
Common property institutions that empower local elites rather than most local resource users are likely to generate policies that benefit the elites disproportionately. For example, see Ensminger 1990, Plateau 2003.
Design principle number 4, monitoring. After the resource users create their rules, they need to create a system to monitor and enforce the rules, to keep watch for rule breaking, and to dole out consequences to rule breakers. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel pretty uncomfortable when talking about monitoring and enforcing rules. You know, it makes me think of some lame-ass hall monitor snitching on you for getting high, or worse, police who beat you, put you in chains, and then drag you off to a cage to lock you up with rapists. But things are different in a commons that is governed in a way that is genuinely non-hierarchical. The rules are not created by a ruling class or by an elite minority to support their system of domination, which is hard to imagine, I know, because of what we're used to. Instead, the resource users create their own rules and design those rules in their own interests to protect and preserve their shared resource and to make sure that what each person gives and receives is fair and equitable. And furthermore, the resource users usually do their own monitoring and enforcement, and if not, then they're the ones who hire the monitors to do that job for them. And if monitors are going to be hired, then it's better that the resource users be the ones to hire them rather than the state, because that way the monitors are directly accountable to the resource users, and also the resource users can replace the monitors if they think that they're doing a bad job. And there's another aspect of monitoring that is also very important, and that is monitoring the resource itself and making sure that it's not showing any signs of degradation or depletion. It's easy to understand why monitoring the resource is important, but why is it important to monitor the resource users? I mean, if the resource users are already making their own rules and they're already agreeing to follow them, then wouldn't that be enough? Unfortunately, it's not always enough.
In every group, there will be individuals who will ignore norms and act opportunistically when given a chance. There are also situations in which the potential benefits will be so high that even strongly committed individuals will break norms.
Let's say that you're a peasant farmer, meaning a farmer who's a peasant and not a farmer who grows peasants, and the irrigation system that you use is shared as a common resource. In normal circumstances, you might be happy to follow the rules about how much water you can take to irrigate your crops. But let's say that there's a drought, and now your crops are wilting. If you only take as much water as the rules allow, your crops might die. But if you take extra water, that might save your crops for the entire season. That is a very high reward for breaking the rules. And if monitoring on the commons is weak, then your chances of getting caught are very low. So now that is a low risk and high reward situation, which is a very tempting combination. But the problem, of course, is that if you do take the extra water, that leaves less water for everyone else, and then their crops are even more likely to die. So under extreme circumstances, such as drought, it becomes more likely that people will break rules. And in addition to this, there may be a small percent of people who are breaking the rules even under normal circumstances. And if these rule breakers just get away with it, that means they're getting advantages at the expense of those who are following the rules, which means that those who are following the rules, they might start breaking the rules too, because they'll be like, wait, why should I play by the rules when others aren't? What am I, a sucker?
Because if I'm going to be the good guy that doesn't harvest way out here, I'm going to be a good guy harvesting back so that together we go to sustainable yield. I've got to trust that you will do the same, because if I'm a good guy and you harvest as much as you want, I'm a sucker. And humans don't like being suckers.
If even just a few people feel like suckers, this can set off a chain reaction where the people who feel like suckers start to break the rules, which then makes more people feel like suckers, which then leads to more people starting to break the rules, and on it goes. So it's no surprise that there have been various research studies suggesting that monitoring is indeed important for successful commons. For example, a study of forests located in 12 countries and used by 178 forest user groups found that regular monitoring, along with giving penalties to rule breakers, is strongly and statistically associated with better forest conditions. Monitoring can be done by the resource users themselves. Like, for example, they can just take turns doing monitoring duties. And it's often true that resource users make the best monitors because they have, a strong motivation to do their job well, because they want to make sure that nobody is overusing and depleting the resource that they depend on. If the people who do the monitoring are just hired as employees and they're not actually people who use the common resource themselves, then they're probably not going to be as strongly motivated as the resource users are to keep vigilant watch. However, Ostrom points out that they can be given a little extra boost of motivation by rewarding them for a job well done. Like, for example, there are various communities in Spain where farmers are sharing a common irrigation system, and these farmers have set things up so that when one of them pays a fine for breaking a rule, the monitor who catches them gets to keep a portion of the payment. Monitoring can be costly, either costly in money because the monitors are hired and must be paid a salary, or costly in time because the resource users themselves are the ones who have to take time to do the monitoring. As we discussed earlier, when costs are high, this can make resource users less willing to even start governing a commons in the first place. So finding ways to reduce monitoring costs can be very helpful. Elinor Ostrom mentions a few possible methods of monitoring that keep the costs pretty low. So presented to you now in no particular order, here they are. Number 1. The costs of monitoring can basically be brought down to zero if the monitoring can take place as like a natural side effect of people using the common resource. For example, in Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons story, all the villagers graze their cows in the same pasture. So if the villagers make rules about how many cows they're each allowed to graze, they can easily see if someone has broken this rule. Number 2, this is another one where monitoring takes place as like a natural side effect of using the resource. But in this one, the people who would be most affected or hurt by people cheating or breaking the rules, they're naturally put into close proximity with the people who are the potential cheaters. For example, remember the fishery in Turkey in Alanya? The fishers designed a rotation system to move from one fishing spot to another, so everyone gets equal time fishing in the best and worst spots. In this system, monitoring is automatic because if anyone tries to take one of the better fishing spots when it's not their turn, then whoever actually is supposed to be in that spot will know right away and will be damn sure not to let it happen. And really just knowing that your chances of being caught are like 100% just prevents people from even trying to cheat in the first place. And everyone cooperates with the system because they know it's in their best interest to do so, because they remember what things were like before they had these rules and how it was just so much worse for everyone. Number 3, monitoring costs can be kept low or even eliminated if the resource users all harvest the resource at the same time and then return to the same location when they're done. So that way everyone sees how much of the resource everyone else has taken. Now that does not mean counting and weighing and measuring what each person has taken. And actually that level of intense scrutiny can be bad for morale. It's basically like screaming, "No one can be trusted," over and over and over. So instead of all that, all you really need to do is just keep an eye out for a level of excess that can easily be seen at a glance. So for number 3, this type of monitoring, it's not really going to be compatible, or it's not going to work for a lot of commons, for a lot of types of resources. But it does work in some situations, like, the examples that I got it from, the villagers are harvesting trees for timber. They only did that like once a year or something like that. So it was pretty easy for them to all do it at the same time and then see what everyone else has taken and get a sense that, nobody is taking an obscene amount. But, for a lot of resources where people are drawing from that resource on a sporadic basis or a daily basis, it's a lot harder to coordinate that kind of thing, to just keep an eye on each other and all be like, doing it at the same time or whatever. This is really not compatible with many situations, but when it is possible, it's a good low-cost method. The need for monitoring and enforcement is amped up in a system such as capitalism, where everyone is pursuing their own profit. This competitive pursuit of profit, it amplifies the temptation to cheat and to take more for yourself while leaving less for everyone else. Now, I'm not saying that the need for monitoring and enforcement would just disappear if capitalism disappeared. In my opinion, likely not. But if we created an economic system that strives to remove the incentive for economic competition and that has no profit motive, then we would need way less monitoring and way less enforcement. Design principle number 5, gradually escalating penalties. This means that the penalties for breaking a rule start small and then gradually increase. So if it's my first time breaking a rule, I'll get just a small penalty. But if, incorrigible scoundrel that I am, I continue to break the rules.
No. Get no, eh?
Then the penalty will increase each time. It also means that penalties escalate based on the severity of the offense. So the worse the offense, the worse the penalty. And if you're wondering what these penalties actually are, well, they can be, all kinds of things, but usually it's paying a fine. Or, at least that was true for most of the cases that I read. Okay, so now the question is, why does this matter? Why do gradually escalating penalties help a commons to succeed? When people are punished too harshly for breaking a rule, they're probably going to feel that it's unfair. And this is especially true if they broke the rule only due to a misunderstanding or a mistake, or due to desperation caused by exceptionally difficult circumstances. And if they feel that a punishment is unfair, then they might become resentful. And if people become resentful, that's going to be bad for the morale of the community, and it's going to be a threat to the stability of the commons because people are just going to feel less willing to follow the rules of a system that they resent. That's why it's best to start with a small penalty. This is enough to show the rule breaker and everyone else that rule breaking won't go unnoticed and that it will have consequences. And in most cases, this is all it takes to keep rates of rule breaking low. But it isn't always enough, and penalties don't always stay low. In Japan, there are various villages that have shared forests and pasture land for centuries. Penalties are usually fines, ranging from very low to quite high. But in the most extreme cases, a person can face a much harsher penalty, being banished from the village. Now, I know that banishment is a brutal punishment. There's no doubt about that. But, I don't like it, but at the same time, I'm also aware that, for centuries, these villagers, they relied on these commons for food and fuel and for heat in the cold winters. These are things that they depend on for survival. And if someone has proven to be a threat to that and refusing to change despite multiple warnings and multiple smaller penalties, well, then I guess I can't really judge people if they decide to force that person into exile, even if I really don't like it. Thankfully, banishing someone from any of these villages has only happened a few times over the course of multiple centuries. So although some situations may require pretty intense penalties, other situations require mercy and no penalties at all. For example, those villages in Japan that we were just talking about, they have a rule that every household must contribute labor to help keep their common forest and pasture land in good condition. And this includes, among other things, making a small controlled forest fire once a year. And that's because it helps to prevent larger, out-of-control forest fires. And making this small fire happen is a lot of work. They have to cut 9-foot firebreakers, set them up, light the blaze, then watch for hours without falling asleep, and they even have to fight the fire if the flames jump the firebreak. Yikes. So the rule is that each household must contribute labor towards things like this that are necessary to maintain the commons in good condition. And they enforce this rule scrupulously, but they're not like cold-hearted jerks about it, right? They treat people with flexibility and forgiveness. To quote Margaret A. McKean, illness, family tragedy, or the absence of able-bodied adults whose labor could be spared from routine chores were recognized as excuses for getting out of collective labor. Okay, so that is design principle number 5, gradually escalating penalties. Don't go down too hard or too fast on people who go astray. I said go down instead of come down in the previous clip, which has a completely different meaning. Don't go down too hard or too fast on people who go astray.
Warm nuts.
Okay. Gradually escalating penalties. Don't come down too hard or too fast on people who go astray. After all, the research shows that in commons where penalties start small and then increase only gradually, most people play by the rules and the system works. Design principle number 6, conflict resolution mechanisms. This means that resource users have well-established procedures for resolving their conflicts, so that conflicts can be resolved swiftly, cheaply, and easily with little to no cost and little to no delay. Conflict resolution can be quite informal, like, for example, by just having a mediator who can help people to resolve their conflict. But conflict resolution on a commons can also be quite formal and elaborate, like is the case for some communities in Spain where farmers share common irrigation systems. In these communities, the water is so scarce and the conflict so frequent that they actually created their own court system. And in Valencia, it even has a pretty cool name, Tribunal de las Aguas, which means Tribunal of the Water. And by the way, these courts are not at all connected to the court system in Spain on any level of government whatsoever. These are entirely independent institutions that are created by the farmers who share a common irrigation system. The farmers have been using their courts for centuries, and this entire time they have been running the courts themselves. All of the officials in the court are farmers who have been elected by their fellow farmers. Oh, and interestingly, I think it's worth mentioning that their court system does not use lawyers. Also interesting is that the court proceedings often draw many farmers from the community who sit and watch the confrontation unfold with, like, rapt fascination. I don't know, I guess it sounds fun. With drama like that, you don't need Twitter. You don't need reality TV. You don't even need
warm nuts.
All you need is the drama of the commons.
I just want to let you girls know that I'm a real messy bitch. I'm a messy bitch who lives for drama.
But in most commons, conflict resolution mechanisms are not this elaborate or formal, and that's fine. You know, whatever works for the situation, you know, if the conflict resolution mechanisms are much more simple and informal, as long as there's a clear set of procedures in place, then that's good enough. So now we turn to the question, why do conflict resolution mechanisms help a commons to succeed? When people are sharing a scarce and valued economic resource, it shouldn't be surprising that conflicts will sometimes arise, even if everyone is really making an honest effort to follow the rules. This is explained very well by Elinor Ostrom, so I'm gonna just go ahead and quote her at length.
Even such a simple rule as each irrigator must send one individual for one day to help clean the irrigation canals before the rainy season begins can be interpreted quite differently by different individuals. Who is or is not an individual according to this rule? Does sending a child below age 10 or an adult above age 70 to do heavy physical work meet this rule? Is working for 4 hours or 6 hours a day of work? Does cleaning the canal immediately next to one's own farm qualify for this community obligation? What happens if someone forgets about a Labor Day and does not show? Or what happens if the only able-bodied worker is sick or unavoidably in another location? There must be some mechanism for discussing and resolving what constitutes an infraction. If individuals who make honest mistakes or face personal problems that occasionally prevent them from following a rule do not have access to mechanisms that will allow them to make up for their lack of performance in an acceptable way, rules may come to be viewed as unfair, and conformance rates may decline.
Conflict resolution mechanisms are very important. They don't guarantee that resource users will be successful at governing the commons, but, in the words of Elinor Ostrom,
it is difficult to imagine how any complex system of rules could be maintained over time without such mechanisms.
Design principle number 7, no obstruction by the state. This design principle is a little weird because it doesn't actually have anything to do with the actions of the resource users and the methods that they use for governing a commons. Instead, it has to do with the actions of state authorities, whether those authorities be from the national government, regional government, or local government. Design principle number 7 means that the state allows the resource users to self-govern the commons. It does not meddle in their affairs. It does not undermine their rules. It does not butt in and try to be boss. In Ostrom's words, this design principle is
minimal recognition of rights to organize. The rights of appropriators,
aka resource users,
to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external governmental authorities.
So, why does this matter? Why does this help a commons to succeed? Sometimes government authorities interfere in a commons because they think they know best how to govern it. And furthermore, they think it is their right to govern it. So, to hell with anyone else who is doing it first. But state authorities, they usually lack knowledge about the local ecology of a commons and of the local communities that use the commons. And without this knowledge of the local ecology and of the local economy and local culture, their attempts to make policies for a commons can be ineffective and even downright harmful. But the ones who do have knowledge of the local ecology, economy, and culture are obviously the resource users. And that's why if the state comes in and imposes its own laws and casts aside the procedures and rules that the resource users had put in place, that can seriously screw things up. And there are other ways that a state can obstruct people from effectively and successfully governing a commons. And a great example of this is what happened in the inshore fishery on the beaches of southern Sri Lanka in the village of Maweli, or probably pronounced kind of differently from that, but I'm trying my best. If you saw the previous video, you'll probably remember this example. It's the one where the fishers use a giant half-mile long fishing net called a beach seine, and they had designed a complex and very effective rotation system to equalize the opportunities of each net to catch fish. These fishers had created effective rules to govern their common fishery, and they were doing a good job at monitoring and enforcing them. So far, so good. But there remained one very big problem. The problem was too many fishers and too many nets. So now each net was catching fewer fish, and of course, with fewer fish caught, they were making less money. Now, there hadn't always been too many fishers. Back in 1933, the government passed a law requiring that every beach sign fishing net be registered, and it also set a limit on the total number of nets. However, the government did not enforce this limit, and by the 1940s, Maweli became overcrowded with fishers, and the problem was getting worse every decade. Things then came to a crisis point in the mid-1960s, because in the mid-1960s, an entrepreneur named David Mahatia came along and used his wealth and political influence to convince local government officials to increase the total number of registered nets from 84 to 108, increasing the number of nets by 24 new nets, all belonging to him. Once again, the government was failing to enforce its own law, limiting the number of nets. It wasn't the first time, but it was the worst time. A 30% increase in nets in just 1 year. This was a huge economic threat to the other fishers. They had already seen their incomes plummet into poverty due to the overcrowding of the fishery with too many nets. And by the way, the nets themselves are so expensive that most fishers don't even own an entire net, but just co-own one net with several other fishers. And now, this rich-ass businessman was just busting up in there like a wrecking ball and buying 24 nets. And to add insult to injury, he wasn't even going to do the fishing by his own labor. He was going to hire a bunch of workers to do the work for him while he just sits back and rakes in the profits. So the other fishers were like, hell no, to the no, 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 yeah, to the no. By their own efforts, the fishers were able to prevent these new nets from launching for several weeks. But then, one day, David Mahatia and his posse decided to fight back, and he tried to launch one of his nets by force. This triggered a physical confrontation between the fishers, or as Elinor Ostrom phrased it, a brawl at sea. Gather up, boys. It's time for a good old-fashioned sea brawl. large crowds of fishers from different factions started gathering on the beach. Things were popping off. And one of the boats even overturned, which, that's classic sea brawl stuff right there. I mean, if a boat's not overturned, can you even really call it a sea brawl?
I'm a messy bitch who lives for drama.
Only the arrival of 3 jeep loads of armed police, whom David Mahaty had warned in advance, prevented a riot. The police stayed on for weeks to ensure that the 24 new nets were added to the sequence.
So, to sum up, the fishers in this village were doing a good job of governing their common fishery, but that was sabotaged by the government. First, because it refused to enforce its own law limiting the number of fishing nets, and then when the fishers tried to enforce this limit themselves, the state sabotaged things again. In rolled the police, armed with their handcuffs and their guns, which means they were also armed with the threat of prison and the threat of death. So, to put it bluntly, the state used violence to prevent people from governing their commons. But when the state sabotages the commons, it doesn't have to involve such a dramatic confrontation as this, and it usually doesn't, right? The state can sabotage the commons simply by not allowing the resource users to enforce their own procedures and rules, or by creating laws that undermine and contradict those rules. And when this happens, it leaves the commons vulnerable to being overused and damaged by selfish, profit-seeking people and businesses. Design principle number 8, nested organizational structure, if the commons and/or population size are large. A nest is a cozy home for cute baby birds, but it's not just that. Another meaning of nest as a verb is, quote, to fit one object inside another. So, for example, those Russian Matryoshka dolls, they can be described as nesting one inside the other. Nesting can also apply to the structure of organizations and institutions. So, like, for example, a high school math department and science department, an English department, and all the other academic departments within the school. Each department is an organization that is nested within the school. And then that school, along with all the other schools in the district, they are all organizations that are nested within the school board for that district. Resource users who govern a commons have done so by organizing themselves. But whether or not they need to organize themselves into a nested structure, well, that depends. Usually, nested structures are only necessary when there's a large resource system or a large population that is using the resource. And that leads to the question of why do nested organizational structures help larger commons to succeed? Research shows that governance of a commons is more likely to fail when the resource system is large, or, when it's a large geographic area where the resource is extracted from. One reason for this is because when a resource system is very large, then there might actually be different environmental conditions and social conditions in the different geographic areas where that resource is found. And then that might require like a different set of rules and policies and procedures in order to properly manage the resource according to the different conditions that exist in the different geographic locations. So if the resource users try to govern their commons with one single organization and one single set of policies, things might not work out so well. Better to divide into various subgroups of resource users and then create local organizations to govern each local area of the commons. But wait a minute. The entire resource system is connected, and what happens in one local area of the commons affects what happens in every other area. This is going to require a larger organization of governance for the entire resource system or, resource extraction area. Smaller local organizations are just not going to be enough. Is this an unresolvable dilemma? No. We don't have to choose between the small and the large, the local and the all-encompassing. With nesting, both these things can come together, with small local organizations being nested inside the larger all-encompassing organization. And we've already seen an example of this with the farmers in Sri Lanka, who govern a common irrigation system. At the first level of organization is the field canal organization, with all the farmers who share a field canal of the irrigation system, usually about 15 of them. And the second level of organization is called the distributory canal organization. It has up to 300 farmers, all who share the same distributory canal of the irrigation system. And each distributory canal organization has several field canal organizations nested within it. And then there is a third level of organization, the Area Council. And there are 4 of these councils for the left bank region of the Gal-Oya River, each area encompassing about 5,000 farmers. And each one of these councils has the first level and second level organizations nested within.
The problems facing irrigators at the level of a tertiary canal or field canal are different from the problems facing a larger group sharing a secondary canal or distributory canal. Those, in turn, are different from the problems involved in the management of the main diversion works that affect the entire system. Establishing rules at one level, without rules at the other levels, will produce an incomplete system that may not endure over the long run.
Resource users will also need a nested structure if there are just like too many of them to all fit in one meeting. And they'll probably also need a nested structure if they live very scattered and dispersed geographically, which means that, it would be kind of a hassle for them to travel a long distance to all show up at the same meeting. Ostrom says that a commons is more likely to fail, quote,
in settings where large numbers of resource users have no links to one another and cannot communicate effectively.
The bigger a population, the harder it is to communicate. And if you can't communicate, then self-governance is impossible. But thankfully, the communication problems that are caused by being on a large scale or having a large population can be solved with a nested structure. In a nested structure, the resource users are divided into several smaller local organizations for local self-governance, and they're also united in a larger organization for self-governance of the entire resource system. This larger organization is run not by all of the resource users, but by members who are selected from each of the smaller organizations who serve as delegates for each of the organizations that they've been selected from. These delegates, when they meet together, can pass information back and forth from each of the small organizations to each other, and that way they're able to basically form conduits for intergroup communication and intergroup decision-making. And there's no reason why this nested structure needs to stop at only 2 layers. There can be layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of nested structures, like a big wedding cake, except for self-governance. Now, that being said, the level of direct control that every individual has tends to be diluted the larger the population gets and the more layers of nested structures are added because, people's direct involvement in decision-making becomes increasingly removed. Definitely still each individual is more empowered in comparison to how it is when, you're just like voting for a representative to just go off to the government and do whatever the hell they want. This sort of like self-governance structure with nested organizations and delegates is very different because the delegates are supposed to be like taking direct guidance from the organizations that selected them. So that, the individuals in the local organizations do have a lot of influence over the actual decisions being made. That the delegates are more just like facilitators for decision-making rather than ultimate decision makers. But the degree of influence does start to get watered down each time a layer is added. So, there are trade-offs when you do have these larger organizational structures, but as long as like the local self-governance remains pretty autonomous within everything, then individuals can still be empowered, at least at the local level. This is something I'll be getting into more in future videos, but I'm just going to leave it at that for now. Review and commentary. Okay, those are the 8 design principles that Ostrom found among successful commons. So let's quickly review what they are. Oh, and by the way, I've put these all into my own words. Probably should have mentioned that before, but there you go. 1. Clearly defined boundaries, both physical boundaries and social boundaries. 2. Rules are a good fit for local conditions, and they provide each resource user with benefits that are proportional to contribution. 3. The people who must follow the rules are the people who make the rules. 4. Monitoring. 5. Gradually escalating penalties. 6. Conflict resolution mechanisms. 7. No obstruction by the state. And 8. Nested organizational structure, if the commons and or population size are large. In her book, Governing the Commons, Ostrom presents some pretty decent evidence that these 8 design principles really do help achieve successful governance of a commons. Of the cases she analyzed in her book, all of the successful cases were characterized by all of these design principles. And all the failing cases were only characterized by between 0 and 3 of these principles. But Ostrom was careful not to overstate her conclusions, and she urged the need for further research. And since then, there has been further research, and it has generally confirmed her earlier findings. For example, according to a meta-analysis on 112 published studies, 3/4 of these conclude that the 8 design principles do indeed have a statistically significant influence on whether a commons is successful. And there's a little quote from the meta-analysis that I would like to share. It says, "By and large, the literature examined is supportive of the design principles. If there is a consistent critique, it is implicit rather than explicit, and would be that they are incomplete rather than incorrect. Many studies suggest additional criteria for successful collective action or similar outcomes." And speaking of suggesting additional criteria, I'd like to do exactly that and suggest a few additional design principles for successfully governing a commons. Now, I know I'm just some random YouTuber who only researched this topic for a few months. So, for me to suggest additional design principles, I think probably like half of you right now think that I'm arrogant, and the other half of you think that I'm arrogant and delusional. And that criticism may be true, but in my defense, I'm basing these additional design principles on research that was done by Ostrom and her colleagues. And also in my defense, delusional arrogance can actually be a sign of childhood trauma, or at least that's what a therapist that I saw on TikTok said. So it's really not very nice to judge me, okay? So anyways, here is my suggestion for design principle number 9, community connectedness. In Chapter 3 of Governing the Commons, Ostrom discusses some case studies of successful commons that have lasted at least a century, and most which have lasted for multiple centuries. Near the end of this chapter is a section where she notes some similarities between these successful and long-lasting commons. And she says the following.
The populations in these locations have remained stable over long periods of time. Individuals have shared a past and expect to share a future. It is important for individuals to maintain their reputations as reliable members of the community. These individuals live side by side and farm the same plots year after year. They expect their children and their grandchildren to inherit their land.
If there's a stable population in a particular place, that's obviously going to make people more motivated to take good care of a commons and not overuse it, right? Because they're going to want it to be in good condition for their kids and grandkids. But I can understand why Ostrom did not make population stability a design principle, because even though it's a feature that's found in many successful commons, and even though it probably helps people to self-govern a commons successfully, it's not something that can actually be designed into how a commons is governed. It is very difficult to influence how stable a population is, right? Like how frequently people move. So knowing that population stability is an influential factor, it just doesn't provide any sort of guidance for how to actually govern a commons. However, when a community has a stable population, that community is also more likely to be one where people are, socially connected to each other. And by socially connected, I mean the opposite of alienated, right? Like people know each other. I'm not saying they're all friends, but social interactions between members of the community are a pretty normal part of daily life. There's like no sense of being anonymous. Everyone is familiar to you, and you're familiar to everyone else. Although having a stable population for many generations does help create community connection, this extreme level of stability is not necessary. And there are many other factors that influence the degree of community connection. And it's within people's control to build greater connectedness in their community, like by talking to neighbors or inviting them over, or by organizing community events. Community connectedness is not necessarily easy to build, but it is at least possible to improve the degree of connectedness that exists in a community. But anyways, why is community connectedness relevant to successfully governing a commons? And why should it be design principle number 9? I can think of 4 reasons. Reason this matters number 1, easier to get started. Community connectedness makes it easier to bring people in the community together to start governing a commons in the first place. Getting started with this requires that resource users come together in meetings, and it's a lot easier to convince someone to come to a meeting with people that they're familiar and comfortable with than it is to convince them to go to a meeting with people that they're awkward with and just are like, who the hell are you? Reason this matters number 2, increased concern with reputation. Community connectedness increases the degree to which people care what their neighbors think of them. At various points in governing the commons, Ostrom mentions resource users not wanting to break the rules of the commons because they know it would hurt their reputation with their neighbors. But if they lived in a community where neighbors just aren't speaking or interacting with each other, then, it's a lot easier to not care what they think, and people would tend to feel less restraint about breaking the rules of the commons. Reason this matters number 3, increased trust. Community connectedness tends to increase the trust between members of a community. And trust is another thing that Ostrom emphasizes the importance of when it comes to having a successful commons. For example, she says that resource users will be more likely to create a successful system of governance for their commons if they
share generalized norms of reciprocity and trust that can be used as initial social capital.
When there is trust between resource users, then they are more likely to believe that other people are following the rules of the commons. And research shows that people are more likely to follow rules when they believe that everyone else is doing so too. We talked about this earlier, how when people think that others are breaking the rules or know that others are breaking the rules, then they're more likely to feel like a sucker, to be like, well, they're getting all these advantages and it's coming at my expense, because they're breaking the rules and I'm not. So I might as well break the rules too. That can, start to happen just based on suspicion, not based on like people actually breaking the rules, but just if there's not proper trust in the community, they might just suspect others are breaking the rules because they're like, well, I don't know who these people are really. I don't trust them. But the more connectedness there is in a community, the more trust there is, the more likely people are to follow the rules because they're like, well, I think everyone else is too. So reason this matters number 4, increased loyalty. Community connectedness increases the loyalty between members of the community, right? So people will be less likely to take too much from the commons because to do so would mean cheating and betraying those who they know and care about. Earlier in this video, when discussing design principle number 5, we saw how in successful commons, the penalties for rule breaking, they tend to start very low and then escalate only gradually. So on these commons, the cost of breaking the rules was actually very low, and yet breaking the rules was very, very unusual, which you might find quite surprising. And Ostrom herself actually found it surprising too.
The initial sanctions used in these systems are surprisingly low.
And even more surprising is that the rules of these commons are usually followed even in situations where the financial benefit of breaking a rule is so high that even if you got caught and paid a fine, you're still going to come away from it with a net financial gain, and a large net financial gain at that.
Thousands of opportunities have arisen in which large benefits could have been reaped by breaking the rules, while the expected sanctions were comparatively low. Stealing water during a dry season in the Spanish huertas might on occasion save an entire season's crop from certain destruction. Avoiding spending day after day maintaining the Philippine irrigation systems might enable a farmer to earn needed income in other pursuits. Harvesting illegal timber in the Swiss or Japanese mountain commons would yield a valuable product. Given the temptations involved, the high levels of conformance to the rules in all these cases have been remarkable. In the cases described here, no external authority has had sufficient presence to play any role in the day-to-day enforcement of the rules in use. Thus, external enforcement cannot be used to explain these high levels of compliance.
In cases like these where rule breaking has a low cost and high reward, game theory predicts that rates of rule breaking will be high, even universal. But these predictions fail to match reality. Game theory assumes that people are motivated purely by economic self-interest, calculating economic costs and economic gains as their only guiding value. If that were true, then rule breaking on a commons would be just so much more frequent, and penalties would need to be a lot higher from the very start. But thankfully, people, well, most people, they care about a lot more than just economic self-interest. The rules on a commons are rules that the resource users agree to and that they know are for a good cause, right? Because they're to benefit themselves and to benefit everyone else who uses the commons. And most people are going to feel guilty if they break rules that they had already agreed to and that they know are for a good cause, because that violates their moral code. And most people are also going to feel ashamed if they get caught breaking those rules because they don't want to look bad in the eyes of their neighbors. And this all brings us back to community connectedness, right? Because community connectedness, it enhances all of these feelings, and therefore it reduces the likelihood that people will violate the rules of a commons. My suggestion for design principle number 10, willing and able to change. As I've already mentioned, Elinor Ostrom, in her book Governing the Commons, analyzes commons that have existed for a long-ass time.
The youngest set of institutions to be analyzed in this chapter is already more than 100 years old. The history of the oldest system to be examined exceeds 1,000 years.
But the fact that the members of a community have been governing a commons for centuries doesn't mean that they've just been governing it the same way this whole time. Not at all. In fact, being able to be flexible and change with the times is a key reason why these institutions have lasted this long. In Ostrom's words,
the institutions discussed in this chapter have survived droughts, floods, wars, pestilence, and major economic and political changes.
That's a lot of changes to survive, and the only way to survive all these changes is to adapt.
By indicating that these common pool resource institutions have survived for long periods of time, I do not mean that their operational rules have remained fixed. The appropriators modified their rules over time in light of past experience.
And the ability to change isn't just important in the long term. In fact, it can be most important early on when you're just getting started, because that's when you're creating rules and policies and procedures for the very first time. And it's really hard to get things right on your first try, you know? You have to do things through trial and error. You have to learn from your mistakes.
Some dams wash out after the first heavy rains. Some rules cannot be enforced because no one is able to monitor conformance to them. By definition, trial and error methods involve error, perhaps even disasters. Over time, appropriators gain a more accurate understanding of the physical world and what to expect from the behavior of others.
So, resource users who self-govern a commons, they need to be willing to make changes when necessary, and they need a system of governance that is able to make those changes, and make them fast. If not, then a commons that had been successful can quickly fail under changing circumstances. And this brings us back to a point that we talked about earlier in the video. Consensus decision-making versus majority rules decision-making. So again, the consensus decision-making is when everyone doesn't necessarily have to agree with a decision in order for that decision to pass, but there has to be no one who is so steadfastly against that decision that they decide to block it. Because even one individual has the power to block a decision if they choose to do so. And then majority rules decision making is when a decision can pass if it gets at least 51% of the people in the organization voting for that decision. And, I'm really simplifying things. It's a little more complicated. In both situations, it's not like just like a vote happens or whatever without any process. In both cases, there's a process of discussion. In consensus decision making, there's a lot of discussion to like try to find something that everyone can agree to. And like, if there's, let's say, a decision that like not everyone's on board with, it's like, okay, how can we kind of tweak it and adjust it and change it so that we can get everyone to be willing to accept it? And something similar can also happen in majority rules decision making. Like there can still be a process of trying to build a greater level of agreement with that decision, or like a greater level of acceptance for it, by like tweaking and amending it and changing it slightly so that like, there's just more support for it. That kind of process can happen in both consensus decision making and majority rules decision making. But obviously in consensus decision making, there's more emphasis on it because of the fact that even one person can block a decision. Okay, so that's a basic rundown of consensus decision-making versus majority rules decision-making. And now we're going to move on to apply that to a situation that we talked about earlier. So earlier, we saw how in Sri Lanka, the farmers who govern their common irrigation system, they use consensus decision-making. And we saw how this helps them to prevent the ethnic or political majority from throwing its weight around and always getting its way at the expense of other groups. And preventing this is a big achievement in a country with a recent history of violent ethnic conflict and where it's pretty normal to find political institutions that are supposedly nonpartisan, but that actually favor a particular political faction. So consensus decision-making clearly has benefits, but it has downsides too. And one of those downsides is that it can make it a lot harder to change the current rules or just to change the status quo, whatever that status quo happens to be. And Ostrom makes this point when discussing villagers in Switzerland who are struggling to change the rules of their commons to adapt to recent changes in the economy. And just FYI, another word for consensus is unanimity. And I'm telling you that because that's the word that Ostrom is about to use in the following quote.
Villages that rely on unanimity rules for changing their common property institutions are not adjusting as rapidly as are those villages that rely on less inclusive rules for changing their procedures.
So the bottom line here is that consensus decision-making can be pretty bad at responding to the need for change, which makes sense. I mean, it's hard to change if that change can be blocked by as little as one person. My suggestion for design principle number 11, utilizing the knowledge of experts. Earlier in this video, we saw that if you want to create effective rules to successfully govern a commons, then you need to be knowledgeable about the local ecology / local environment, the local economy, the local culture, and knowledgeable about the resource itself. And we saw that resource users of a commons tend to be knowledgeable about all of these things. In fact, they're often even more knowledgeable about local conditions than professionals and experts. However, there are cases where the knowledge of local resource users is just not enough, and there's a need for knowledge that can only be gained with the help of professionals and experts. For example, if the commons is an underground water supply, the resource users will need to know the maximum amount of water that they can take without causing the water level to drop. Or in other words, they need to know the sustainable extraction rate. But figuring that out requires extensive research, expensive technology, and professional expertise. So clearly, cases like this are in need of professional help, which is something, unfortunately, that I think many of us can relate to. Not me, though. I'm totally fine. I definitely don't need help from professionals or from anybody at all. I'm fine. I'm totally fine. But professional help costs money, and often resource users of a commons cannot afford the help that they need, which, once again, also relatable. I mean, not relatable because I'm totally fine and don't need help, so I can't relate to that at all.
Just call on me, brother, when you need a hand. We all need somebody to lean on me.
Personally, I believe that the world doesn't have to work this way, that humanity, as flawed as we are, can do a whole lot better. We can create a society where if people are sharing a common resource and they need help from engineers or scientists or other professionals to manage that resource effectively, that they can access this help without having to pay a fortune. Or, better yet, without having to pay any money at all. And without access to that help being gate-kept or mediated by a state. And I know that some will say that it's naive to believe this, but I don't think it's naive at all. Nor do I think it's naive to say that we can create a world where we no longer destroy the environment. Or a world where we no longer have economic systems of exploitation and inequality, or governments that, even when they claim to be a democracy, are actually systems of domination. We can do so much better than all of this. And if you want to know how that could possibly be, how could possibly somebody have such an optimistic take in a world that is just tumbling into ever deeper levels of hell? Well, then you might want to check out my video, Post-Capitalism, a detailed look at how it could work. And I know that's now the third time I'm plugging this video, because my love for shameless self-promotion is as boundless as an open access commons. And hopefully this video, the one that you're watching right now, has been at least somewhat helpful in showing you that people are able to share and govern/manage economic resources, and in fact, scarce economic resources, in a way that is egalitarian. And I know that the scale of the examples that I've given in this video has been quite small. The biggest example I described was the one of farmers in Sri Lanka, which involves 19,000 people, which is quite a lot of people, but it's not nearly as many as the population of a city, let alone a country. But still, these examples, they do offer some real-world evidence that it is possible to create a society that is egalitarian. In some of my other videos, I've talked about other real-life examples which inspire this kind of hope. They've also been examples that are on a much larger scale than the things that I've presented in this video, like how during the Spanish Revolution, millions of workers and peasants self-managed the economy and self-governed their communities. And they made great strides towards building a society of egalitarianism and freedom. And they did this until they were violently crushed by a fascist military dictatorship. Or another example that I've discussed is how in India, in the province of Kerala, 3 million people actively participated in economic planning for public goods and services.
Hey, I'm really sorry.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm really sorry too.
I think it is so important to spread awareness about examples like this, which is why I would like to recommend a couple of videos from other channels. One of these videos is from the channel Anarch, and it is called Inside the Zapatista Movement, Mexico's Hidden Revolution. And the other video I'd like to recommend is from the channel Neighbor Democracy, and it's called The Communes of Rojava, a model in societal self-direction. Now, just to be clear, none of the examples in these videos, or in my own videos, none of them are perfect examples of egalitarianism, and I don't endorse everything about them, right? In fact, I have criticisms of all of them. But despite this, overall, I'm deeply impressed by what these movements have achieved. I'm grateful for what they've achieved. I'm humbled by them. And I know we have a lot to learn from them. But anyways, the point is that examples of people self-governing and self-managing economic institutions and communities in a way that is egalitarian, it goes far beyond what you've seen in this video and far beyond the commons in general. And since we are headed for a future where society honestly may be falling apart, one of the things that we should educate ourselves on in order to prepare for this is examples of people who respond to disasters by supporting each other and engaging in mutual aid and creating grassroots institutions in order to do this in an organized way, which then enables them to be more effective and to do all of this on a larger scale. And so I would like to recommend a book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell: The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster. And there is an audiobook version of it if you prefer to listen rather than to read. There's also another book that I'd like to recommend, which you can get online for free, which is called The Response: Building Collective Resilience in the Wake of Disasters. And if you go to the shareable.net website, in addition to that free book, you can click on the tab that says How-To Guides, where you can find a ton of other learning resources that will be both free and useful. And the next learning resource I'd like to recommend is very important. Assuming that you want to be able to continue eating food in a future where, not only couldn't you not go to the grocery store and get food anymore, but growing food in the conventional ways that it's grown now just might not be possible. So it's a Substack website called Zero Input Agriculture. The author of the website, Shane Simonson, he has spent years of his life breeding species of crops that are high in calories and able to grow and thrive with no additional inputs. Just the soil, the sun, and the rain, and using just basic handheld tools. And we may be heading towards a future where growing food locally and using zero additional inputs is the only way to avoid starvation. And that's not to say that this will necessarily be a permanent condition, but even if it lasts only a few generations, or hell, even just a few years, that's still, it's kind of a long time to go without eating. So the knowledge that Shane Simonson shares on his website, it could be crucial to our survival. And he's also recently published a book called Taming the Apocalypse, and this is a conveniently short book that, among other things, analyzes the potential of this DIY low-tech biotech as a basis for a new civilization that could emerge from the collapse of the fossil fuel-fueled civilization we have now. And just to emphasize how time-sensitive all of this may be, here's a little excerpt of the author speaking in a recent interview.
That's a big message in the book. I explore the kinds of projects that people without all of the fancy resources, without the high-tech education, can take on themselves. It's a very much a call to action. The majority of projects that would give the most useful medium to short-term results are things that anyone could do in a suburban backyard. And I want to impress that there's a sense of urgency to doing this kind of work, because the resources that we think are very ordinary for making it possible may not be around for future generations. So the Bunya project, for example, those piranha pine seeds that I imported from South America, US, various places, you need an international communication system, banking system, and postage system in order for them to get from South America to Australia and turn up in my postbox. And we think of that as it's like such an ordinary thing. But 200 years ago, if you wanted to do this project, you would need a royal decree and a fleet of ships to sail all over the planet at great personal risk of dying in a shipwreck. Right. And now we just sit at our computer and type for 5 minutes and cough up a few $100s, and we can do things that past generations and probably future generations would they give their right arm for the opportunity to do what we can do now.
Okay, so there you go. And by the way, that interview excerpt, it comes from an episode of Fight Like an Animal, which is a podcast that I highly recommend. And also the person who does that podcast, Arnold Schroeder, also wrote an article, which is another important learning resource. It's called Components of a Model Political Program for Ecological Survival. And you can find it at the author's website, againsttheinternet.com. Okay, so those are quite a lot of learning resources for you, and I've put the links to all of them below in the video description. But I haven't actually read the books yet, but they were all recommended by people whose judgment I trust, so yeah. And if you have any other learning resources you'd like to recommend, please write them in the comments. Probably best if you write them in response to the pinned comment so that they are easy for other people to find. And one more thing I'll say to maybe inspire some optimism is that even though this world is probably on its way to falling apart, it's also true that this falling apart can open opportunities to build something new. Though, of course, the question is, will this something new be something better or something worse? And that all depends on the choices that we make. And that's why I make the videos that I do. I'm hoping to increase the chances of humanity making the choices that produce a better world instead of a worse one. Though I guess in order to make those better choices, we have to assume that the future world is going to be capable of supporting complex life forms, which, I mean, that itself is not guaranteed, though it also depends on the choices we make. Yeah, I'm sorry to get so bleak. I guess I like to throw a little dash of pessimism into my optimistic pep talks. But anyways, there is a relatively high chance that many of us are going to live to see long-standing institutions of governance and systems of economic production and distribution break down, and something is going to need to take their place. That gives us the chance to build something new and better, something that grows and blooms from the best parts of our humanity, from our brightest and most beautiful potentials. So I hope you will look into potential alternatives to our current political and economic systems, and tell your friends about it too. A better world is possible, and a changing world is inevitable. Okay, so it's almost time to wrap up this video, but first, let's take a few minutes just to review what we've already covered. Because let's face it, with a video this long, it's hard to remember. Early in the video, we looked at some advice for how to get people started in self-governing a commons. We focused on a case study of farmers in Sri Lanka who share a common irrigation system. And from that case study, we discovered 9 things that helped get the self-governance of this commons off the ground. And they are as follows. 1. Organizers were well suited to organize in this particular situation. 2. Organizers received training. 3. Organizers became part of the community. 4. Organizers supported and learned from each other. 5. Organizers took time to understand the farmers and their problems before attempting to organize. 6. Each organizer started by meeting with a small group of farmers. 7. Small groups made small changes before attempting to organize on a larger scale. 8. Organizers did not impose solutions. They helped bring farmers together to find their own solutions. 9. Measures were taken to avoid enabling any faction to have its own way while others did not. And after that, we looked at some more insights for motivating people to start doing the work of self-governing a commons, especially when it comes to persuading people to create and enforce rules for a commons. Insight number 1, most people feel more motivated to avoid loss and harm than they do to achieve gains and benefits. Insight number 2, most people feel more motivated by immediate short-term impacts than by future long-term impacts. Insight number 3, most people feel more motivated to act based on recent events than long-term trends. Next, we looked at how some of the characteristics of capitalism, like the profit motive and economic competition, deserve at least some of the blame, and honestly, usually a lot of the blame, for causing the overuse and depletion of common resources, or as it's often referred to, a tragedy of the commons type situation. And as examples of this, we saw how economic competition for profit drove the failure of 2 fishery commons in Turkey. And we saw how an upsurge in profit-making opportunities caused radiated tortoises to become endangered in Madagascar. And we also saw how Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons parable would not have led to tragedy if the cows were part of the commons rather than private property. Though once again, let's liberate the cows.
Cows with guns.
And after that, we moved on from how to get self-governance for a commons started and looked at how to make a commons successful, with our focus being on the 8 design principles that Elinor Ostrom identified. And these are, number 1, clearly defined boundaries, both physical boundaries and social boundaries. Number 2, rules are a good fit for local conditions, and they provide each resource user with benefits that are proportional to contribution. Number 3, the people who must follow the rules are the people who make the rules. Number 4, monitoring. Number 5, gradually escalating penalties. Number 6, conflict resolution mechanisms. Number 7, no obstruction by the state. Number 8, nested organizational structure if the commons and/or population size are large. And I was also so bold as to throw in a few more design principles. Number 9, community connectedness. Number 10, being willing and able to change. And number 11, utilizing the knowledge of experts. Okay. Just one more thing before we wrap up this video. I want to take a minute to quickly summarize my political philosophy so that you know where I'm coming from. I believe our most important purpose in life is to love each other and love ourselves. Not love as in like, oh, I'm so in love with you, but love as in like caring, compassion, and appreciation. Loving someone in this sense of the word means you want them to thrive, to experience psychological well-being and physical well-being, and to blossom into their own unique expression of their best potential self. And this means you also want them to have the conditions in life that will be most fertile for this, that will make all of this more likely. In my opinion, this is why we should create economic and political systems that maximize freedom and equality for everyone, because this will help maximize the likelihood that each person has conditions in life that enable thriving, well-being, and developing your best potential. I think that social anarchism can provide lots of good guidance towards achieving these goals, though I think I should mention that at times I have disagreed with or have even been deeply disturbed by the opinions of many people who identify as anarchists. At its core, my political philosophy is to take the love in our hearts and manifest it in how we structure society. Okay, here we are, finally wrapping up the video. And this video is actually a sequel to my previous video called The Real Tragedy is Not the Commons. And both that video and this one are actually like part 2 and 3 of a series. And the first video in that series is called How We Lost Our Freedom. So if you haven't already seen these and you want to check them out, the links are down below in the video description, or you can just check on my channel. They are the 2 videos just before this one. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next video or any future videos, then unfortunately, you probably need to click the bell and turn on all notifications. And that's because my video upload schedule is unpredictable and has long gaps with no videos, which means that the YouTube algorithm often does not show my new videos to my subscribers. Which is why subscribing is probably not enough, and selecting all notifications from the bell is the only guarantee to not miss out. And if you like what I do here on this channel and you want to help me to keep going and keep doing what I do, then it would be so wonderful if you could donate to me, whether monthly donations on Patreon or one-time donations on Ko-Fi or on PayPal. The links are on my channel page and in the video description. And of course, it's also a big help if you can spread my videos, either by sharing them or just by telling people about my channel with good old-fashioned word of mouth. Okay, so thank you so much for your help, and thank you also for watching. It has been a pleasure having your company, even though I'm actually sitting here alone in my room, but I feel you with me in spirit. And please remember to love yourself and each other. Bye. See you next time. Hopefully I won't take so long to upload new video. Okay, whatever.
Warm nuts.
Warm nuts in my hand, can't stop the hustle. A better world ahead, out the struggles, muscle.
Warm nuts.
Warm nuts in my hand, can't stop the hustle. A better world ahead, out the struggles, muscle.
Warm nuts.